The Beatles were an English rock band that formed in Liverpool in 1960. With John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, they became widely regarded as the greatest and most influential act of the rock era. Rooted in skiffle, beat, and 1950s rock and roll, the Beatles later experimented with several genres, ranging from pop ballads to psychedelic and hard rock, often incorporating classical elements in innovative ways. The story begins in Liverpool on the 6th of July in 1957, a pivotal day for the history of modern music. It was the day that John Lennon met Paul McCartney for the very first time. In the afternoon, the Quarrymen skiffle group played at the Garden Fete of St. Peter's Church in Woolton, Liverpool. The performance took place on a stage in a field behind the church. The group arrived on the back of a lorry. As well as music, there were craft and cake stalls, games of hoopla, police dog demonstrations, and the traditional crowning of the Rose Queen.
We're here on this rather grey day in the grounds of St. Peter's Church, Woolton, where, on the 6th of July 1957, John Lennon met Paul McCartney. John's group, the Quarrymen, were playing at the annual Garden Fete, the fundraising event of the church, on that afternoon, when Paul McCartney was in the audience, having been brought here by their mutual friend Ivan Vaughan. Ivan lived near John Lennon, but went to school with Paul, so he knew them both. In Paul, Ivan saw someone who could play a guitar like a guitar. John at that stage was playing his like a banjo. Paul could tune a guitar, not John, and Paul could remember all the words of all the songs, whereas John ad-libbed. After the Garden Fete, the group moved over to the church hall just across the road, where John and Paul talked at length, and John realised that Paul would be good for his group. But he felt threatened with this good-looking boy, better equipped musically, so John did nothing. But after about 10 days he came to his senses, and he then sent a message to Paul to come and join the group. So this is where, in my mind, it all began. John meeting Paul.
This imposing sandstone church behind me may seem an unlikely place to stop on our journey through the Beatles' history, but it was here on the 6th of July 1957 that a young Paul McCartney was brought to see the Quarrymen, John Lennon's skiffle group. In a field behind this church, Paul saw the young John Lennon play for the first time and was very impressed, even though John forgot many of the words to the 50s songs he was singing and had to improvise. If you look around this graveyard, you'll find the occasional inspirational clue to the Beatles' presence. Eleanor Rigby's gravestone, Father Mackenzie, all lying in front of the church where the wedding had been. Ken Rawlinson, you're the caretaker of St. Peter's Church.
I am, yes.
Can you tell us about the Beatles' connection with this church?
Well, 40 odd years ago the Beatles played here as a skiffle group on the field at the back in the daytime and in the big church hall in the evening.
And this is where John and Paul first met?
It is, yes.
I believe that there are, in the graveyard, there are some other Beatles connections.
Yes, we have Eleanor Rigby's grave, from the song of course, and we think Father Mackenzie may have been from the Catholic church next door.
Right, so quite a strong part of Beatles history.
Yes, oh yes, yes.
And I believe you recently commemorated the 40th anniversary of John and Paul's meeting.
We did, that was last year, and we repeated the whole fair day and got together the old crowd, the Quarrymen as they were, and they played again on the field in the afternoon and in the evening in the hall as a skiffle group.
And I've heard there was a story about some aircraft that flew over.
Yes, 2 planes came over, 2 small planes, and we thought it was Yoko and Paul who could have been in them, just to have a look at the day.
And they sent their best wishes to you, I believe.
They sent us letters wishing us the best for the day and so on, yes.
So this must be something of a mecca for Beatles fans. Do you get a lot of tourists
here? We do, yes, many tourists from all over the world, in fact, yes.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Ken.
Right, fine.
Hi, and welcome to the most famous nightclub in the world,
The Cavern, Liverpool, where on the 5th of February 1961, 4 young Liverpool lads took to that stage and started a musical sensation that would rock the world. The Cavern opened as a jazz club in 1957, and the Beatles played here 292 times. As their popularity grew, so did their audiences, until eventually so many Liverpool teenagers crowded into this tiny room to see their heroes play that the sweat from their bodies caused condensation to drip from the ceiling and land on the Beatles' instruments, fusing their amplifiers. You could say it was a truly electrifying atmosphere.
Traditional jazz was no longer the big draw. Skiffle had won the fight for a hearing. But these were national trends, too conventional for Liverpool youth. Something new was wanted, and out of the Cavern there emerged a new sound. A few chords strung together on a cheap guitar, a drum for a beat, another guitar, more chords, a bass to give balance. The Mersey beat came firm from the mold. By 1960, beat groups were billed as big attractions. The young generation would listen to little else. New jazz clubs opened overnight. And as the new jazz clubs opened overnight, so the new beat groups came into being. Every facility for the formation of these groups was ready to hand.
The Cavern had opened earlier in the year, on the 17th of January. It was primarily a jazz club, which played host to occasional evening skiffle sessions. The Cavern Club would become a regular venue for Beatles shows, while they remained a Liverpool secret. Once Beatlemania took hold, however, they rarely played in their home city again. The 7th of August in 1957 is commonly believed to be the first date the Quarrymen played at the soon-to-be legendary venue. The other acts on the bill were Ron McKay's skiffle group, Darktown skiffle group, and the Deltones skiffle group. The Cavern Club was owned by Alan Seitner, who played at the same golf club as the Quarrymen's manager, John Lennon's school girlfriend, Nigel Walley. It was through this connection that the nascent band got their first show at the venue. Seitner had heard the group perform at the Childwall Golf Club. However, the Quarrymen's set didn't go down well. They began with Come Go With Me, followed by Hound Dog and Blue Suede Shoes. Although a member of the Quarrymen at this time, Paul McCartney was away at scout camp on this day, and so he did not play. Liverpudlian promoter Charlie Mac McBain held regular skiffle and rock events at his venues. On Friday, the 18th of October in 1957, he ran one such event at the new Clubmore Hall in Norris Green, Liverpool. It was the first show in which Paul McCartney appeared on stage with the Quarrymen. McCartney played lead guitar. First night nerves, however, caused him to make a hash of his solo during the Quarrymen's version of Arthur Smith's 1946 instrumental hit, Guitar Boogie. McCartney's debut with the Quarrymen was a significant occasion in the development of the group. For the promoter, however, they made little solid impression. Charlie Mac's recorded verdict on the group was a scribbled good and bad on the Quarrymen's visiting card. By December 17, 1957, the Quarrymen played Wilson Hall in Liverpool. This was the Quarrymen's second of 4 performances at Wilson Hall in Liverpool's Garston district, one of the venues run by local promoter Charlie Mac McBain. It's believed that this may have been the first time George Harrison saw the group perform, but this is not certain. It's more likely he first saw them at Wilson Hall on February 6 in 1958, although he may have met them elsewhere before then. The venue was situated opposite the Garston Bus Depot and had been built by Francis Wilson. It was a somewhat rough venue favored by local gangs of teddy boys. The Quarrymen's other performances at Wilson Hall were on Thursdays. This was their only Saturday night booking there. The Quarrymen's first live engagement of 1958 was their third at the new Clubmore Hall, a conservative club in Liverpool's Norris Green district. They had originally been due to play a dance on the previous night at Wilson Hall in Garston, but promoter Charlie Mac McBain changed the booking.
Well, when I first became involved with Beatles, say, it was Pete Best, not Ringo. They were all sort of individuals, like Pete attracted a lot of screaming girls for his looks. It didn't matter if he had talent or not. He did, I'm not saying he didn't, but it didn't matter because they would, you know, look up to Pete as he was a very, very good looking young man.
So I knew Pete, he was a very nice fellow, very quiet, kept himself very much to himself, although he did enjoy the attention of the girls. George was also quite quiet, although he did join in bits of the fun and the performance, you know, the other two used to go.
George was a very quiet, and I've been saying this for years, but through his recent passing away, it's become more known. But I always knew George as a very quiet, spoken introvert, if you like, but knew how to play his instrument and knew his music. Paul was, in my mind, in my memory of Paul, still does really, quite Americanized.
Paul was always the keen one. He was always the one that wanted to do things and check the mics and what was the club like, and you know, even down to security. He was always the one that went past the actual show itself. I remember one night, well, one day, we all got drunk. Well, I'm going out of turn out of chronological order, really. I'll come back to that in a minute. So Paul was the one who was the key. He was the sort of, you could say, the head of the group. John was the voice, and then John's voice, I still say it's the best voice in rock and roll, you know. Very, very distinguishable. He just loved rock and roll. He wasn't interested in he didn't even care how much they got paid, John. He was just doing it for fun.
And they called John Lennon the Singing Rage. And I thought, well, the Singing Rage, well, you know, there's a lot of Elvis was the rage, Cliff Richard was a rage, you know, or the rage at the time. But I realised it was a double meaning, because he was the rage of the cavern, but he sang, every song he sang in a rage, you know.
On the 15th of July, John Lennon's mother, Julia, dies. From 1946, John had lived with his Aunt Mimi, Mary Smith, and Uncle George in their house, Mendips, at 251 Menlove Avenue in Liverpool, after Julia had handed over care of her son to them. Despite the living arrangements, Julia came to see John almost every day. In 1958, she bought him his first guitar, a cheap Galatone Champion acoustic guaranteed not to split. Julia shared John's love of rock and roll music. Julia's death deeply traumatized John, who would later refer to her in the songs Julia, Mother, and My Mummy's Dead. His first son, Julian, was named after her. Although the Quarrymen had few formal engagements between March 1958 and the end of the year, they did perform a few times at parties and family events. On the 20th of December in 1958, they played at the wedding reception of George Harrison's brother, Harry, and his bride, Irene McCann. The event was held in Speke, Liverpool. Saturday, August 29th in 1959 was the opening night of the Casbah Coffee Club, a new social club for teenagers, based in the cellar of a large Victorian house at 8 Hayman's Green in Liverpool. The Casbah Coffee Club was run by Mona Best, mother of one Pete Best and owner of the house. She had bought it after winning a horse racing bet in the 1954 Epsom Derby. It had previously been owned by the West Derby Conservative Club and had 15 bedrooms and an acre of land.
It's a good idea to let people know about the Casbah, because they know about the cavern, they know about some of those things, but the Casbah was like the place where all that started. It was actually before the cavern, all of that. And we had a more intimate relationship with it. It was almost our club.
We used to have this, you know, people upstairs, Rory's friends, my friends downstairs, you know, in the living room. And Mo basically turned around and said, because there used to be constant traffic up and down the stairs, and she's trying to decorate the place, and, you know, carpet layers are in, trying to lay carpet and all the rest of it. She went, look guys, You know, there's one den upstairs, there's one den you've taken over my living room, there's cellars downstairs. You know, why don't you go downstairs? Do what you want, you know, lose yourself, make as much noise as you want down there, and just get on with it.
Mo again, come with me to the Casbah. She got the idea from an old Charles Boyer film called Algiers, in which there was a scene where they actually say, come with me to the Casbah. And that stuck in Mo's mind, and from then on it was, come with me to the Casbah.
And consequently, as this work was going on, you know, more people were knocking at the door, and the membership was starting to grow a little bit, till the fateful day, you know, August the 29th, 1959, and the doors opened to the Casbah. It was a fantastic night.
We built as a Quarrymen, and it was like we got together, and I think Mo said, "Oh, have you got a name for the group?" And John said, "Well, I used to have a band called the Quarrymen, like, you know, use that name if you like." I wasn't worried because we were just glad we got a band, you know, for Mo.
I remember the Casbah night, the opening night, because we were upstairs in this house in West Derby, which I didn't know a lot about, obviously, because I wasn't in the museo's business or anything else, but I was with John and Paul. And I think when we went downstairs, and the whole setup was wonderful for an aspiring young rock and roller, to have that on their doorstep and to be able to sort of perform safely. I don't know how to put it. It was safe and it was secure.
And the crowd had already started to gather outside, you know. And remember Rory putting Red River Rock on, which became basically the in-house song for the Casbah. And it started, and the doors opened.
I mean, it was me, John, George, and Ken, yeah, of course, Apple Blossom time. Well, who was drumming then? There wasn't a drummer. No, that was it, because that would fit in, because we used to show up at gigs, those early gigs, and the promoter would say, "Where's your drummer?" We'd say, "The rhythm's in the guitars," and just hold your nerve while he just panicked a bit. Just hope he bought it, you know. So that would have been in that stage, yeah, the rhythm was in the guitars.
I remember the first group I saw there, which they weren't really a group at the time, right, were the Beatles, but it was like John and Paul and some guy called Ken Brown, I think, maybe George. I know Lennon was sitting there as well. So we opened with that, you know, and they came up, you know, and by the time we got on the stage, you know, up here, like, we want the Quarrymen, we want the Quarrymen, you know.
Well, that was like the prelude to it all, really. You know, getting to know each other, getting the vibe of a club, just getting the feel of all of that. It's our gentleman's club. You know, we didn't go to Boodles, we went to the Casbah.
1959 was not too eventful for the Quarrymen, though they did enter the TV Search for a Star competition. The Quarrymen had entered the competition 2 years previously without success. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison returned to Liverpool's Empire Theatre for another preliminary audition. One problem that they did have was that the group did not have a drummer, since Colin Hanton walked out of the Quarrymen on the 1st of January in 1959. Perhaps in a bid to differentiate themselves from their recent lineup with Ken Brown, the group renamed themselves Johnny and the Moondogs for this event. The auditions were held by Mr. Starmaker Carol Levis at Liverpool's Empire Theatre over 3 consecutive Saturdays on the 11th, 18th, and 25th of October. While it is unclear on which date Johnny and the Moondogs appeared, the 18th of October is the most likely. The group successfully passed the audition, qualifying for the regional finals on the 15th of November. The group had much riding on their appearance, which was held at the New Manchester Hippodrome Theatre in Ardwick, Manchester. It would guarantee them a television appearance and resulting fame. Voting in the contest was based on a clapometer, registering audience applause. Johnny and the Moondogs lacked the local support they enjoyed in Liverpool, and anyway couldn't have made much of an impact. Lacking a place to stay in Manchester, they caught the train back home by the time the audience was required to cast its judgment. 1960 didn't start too well for the Beatles. Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison had ditched the Quarrymen and decided to take the name the Silver Beatles. On Tuesday, the 10th of May, at the Blue Angel Club, London-based music promoter Larry Parnes traveled to Liverpool to audition groups to back Billy Fury on a tour of northern England and Scotland. The audition took place at the Blue Angel, a club run by the Silver Beatles' new manager Alan Williams. The venue was previously known as the Wyvern Social Club and was located at 106 to 108 Seal Street in Liverpool. The auditions were filled with several hopeful Liverpool acts, among them Cass and the Casanovas, Derry and the Seniors, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Cliff Roberts and the Rockers, and the Silver Beatles.
I first met the Beatles right here, and not right exactly where I'm sitting now, but in this club which was known as the Jacaranda Coffee Bar Club. And I first encountered them because they went to the art college just up the road, which is virtually 5 minutes from here. And Stuart and John Lennon, they used to skip the lectures because they were interested in rock and roll music. And I used to let all the groups play, like the Big Three, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, Jerry and the Pacemakers. I used to let them rehearse free in the basement because it was doing nothing in the daytime. And then I got to know them as coffee bar layabouts, to be honest with you. And the first time I ever really paid them any money was to decorate this club. The paintings are, some of the paintings have still lasted behind me now. And so that's how I really got to know them. And then the second stage was when I was a promoter as well in those days, and I put a concert on at the local boxing stadium. And the lineup was Eddie Cochran, late Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent, and Larry Parnes, who was the big impresario of the day. And I don't know whether you know, but Eddie Cochran died in a car accident virtually 2 weeks before the show. And I had the option to pull out or to go on with Gene Vincent, because Gene Vincent, though he was in the accident, he was virtually unhurt. So I decided to go on with the show, and I thought, what a good chance to show off the Liverpool groups. So to make up for Eddie Cochran, I put about 5 Liverpool bands on, and the show went off great. And afterwards we all came back to the Jacaranda, you know, just to have coffee, because we weren't licensed in those days, so it was an unlicensed club, as it were. And Larry Parnes was so impressed with the Liverpool groups, he wanted to give them some work. Now, unknown to me, the Beatles were listening to our conversation. And then when I came into the Jack the next day, John and Stuart approached me and said, "Hey Al, when are you going to do something for us, like?" And I thought, there's no more painting to be done. You've painted the ladies' toilets, you've painted the basement. And then they told me they had a group. And by that time I'd got to know them quite well, because I put on a big arts ball and they built the floats for me. And then I said, well, what do you call yourself and where do you play? And they gave me the lineup, which was obvious that they didn't have a drummer. And then I said, well, we've got to get you a drummer. He said, well, we're managing so far without one. And so then I said, I'll ask one of the groups if he knows a drummer. So I called one of the Big Three over, and I said, look, these are a group and they've got a drummer. Can you recommend anybody? And he said, yeah, we do know one, a guy called Tommy Moore. And he said, what do you call yourself, lads? And John said, oh, we call ourselves the Beatles. He said, you'd never get anywhere with a stupid name like that. I became the manager, and then Larry Parnes phoned me up. This was the next stage, as it were. And because he was so impressed with the Liverpool groups, which I put on at the stadium, he asked me to hold auditions, because one of his pop stars was a guy called Billy Fury, who's tragically dead now. And he, being from Liverpool, would have liked to have a Liverpool group to back him. And so we all went to another club which I was just about to open called the Blue Angel. And I thought, well, I'll throw the Beatles in now. To me, they were sort of rough but good enough. And to my surprise, they got the job. Billy Fury said, yes, we would like that group, the Beatles. But they spotted that Stuart Sutcliffe, who was John Lennon's best friend, could hardly play the bass. And they said, but without the bass player. And the reason they gave was that they couldn't afford 5 musicians. And so Stuart would have to go. And to my surprise, John said, no, we're not doing it. If Stu doesn't go with the band, we don't want to do it. And it was a job that any group in Liverpool would have given their right arm to have, you know, been the backing group of one of the best pop singers in the late 50s. I used to have a steel band that used to play in the Jack-around. They used to play in the corner over there. We had no stage, by the way, and it was only half the size of what it is now. Now they've knocked the next door building in, so if you could imagine, it was known as the Black Hole of Calcutta in those days. And I came down expecting the steel band to be playing, and there was no steel band. And I said to one of the staff, well, where's the steel band? And he said, don't you know? I said, no, I don't, wouldn't be asking, would I? And I said, well, they've gone to Hamburg. I said, Hamburg? You know, I'd never even heard of the place then. And so I thought, wow. So I put the Beatles in. So this is one of the first places that the Beatles ever played. And George, who was the baby of the group in those days, came up to see me and said, do you have a mop and a brush, Alan? I said, yes. And I was curious. And then when I went down, they were that impoverished that they actually tied the mics to the end of the brush and the mop, and their girlfriends was holding them up. One of them was Cynthia Lennon, who, as you know, married John. Then I got a letter from Hamburg, from the West Indian Steel Band. By that time, I'd managed to get another steel band. And the letter saying, Alan, it's really swinging over here. With all the contacts and all the groups that you know, why don't you come over here? There's plenty of work here for groups. So I thought, yeah, I'll do that. So I auditioned, the groups that I wanted to go, they all played down, and we made a tape recording. And in those days, it was like a Grundig tape machine. You didn't have these little cassettes which you hold up now. And, you know, it's a reel-to-reel job. And so I took this tape and off I went to Hamburg. And I was going in and out of clubs on the Reeperbahn and the Große Freiheit. And then I hit upon a club which was called the Kaiserkeller. And I could hear rock and roll music coming from the basement. So down I went, and there was this awful German band singing Tutti Frutti with no rhythm and just Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy, Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy. And all the kids weren't even dancing to them. And then there came Der Pause, which means the interval, and they put the jukebox on. Next minute, they were all dancing to Cliff Richards and other American artists, and I thought, this is it. So I asked to see the manager, and I was shown into his office. I had this reel-to-reel tape with me, and I said, have you ever considered having English live musicians over? He brought out his tape recorder. I put the tape on, put it on, pressed the buttons, and waited for this glorious Liverpool Merseybeat sound. Instead, all I got was the tape. Somebody taped over what they'd recorded, because the tape's those days, you could tape on top of the tape, and below you get 2 recordings out of the one tape. But somebody had taped in the middle and ruined it. And I said, yeah, your tape recorder kaput? 9, and he put his tape on, of course. I thought I'd blown it. Back I came with my tail between my legs, as it were. Back to Liverpool, told all the bands that they'd blown it. Somebody had made a cock-up of the tapes. And then I completely sort of forgot it was just an interesting journey which went wrong. And then I was managing another group called Derry and Seniors, who's the leader of that group was a guy called Howie Casey, who's quite well known in the musical business now. And they'd got work with Larry Parnes to do a summer season. They'd all given up their jobs, bought uniforms, and on the 11th hour, Larry Parnes cancelled the whole deal. So they'd all given up their jobs, and they blamed me. And I thought, well, what can I do to save this situation? And I remember there used to be a coffee bar club in London called the Two Eyes. So I had a minibus, and we all went in the minibus. This was about a month after I'd been to Hamburg. And we went down to the Two Eyes. I saw the guy who owned the place, Tommy his name was, and I said, I've got this Liverpool group, do you mind if they play? Well, of course, he didn't mind. He was getting the top group playing for nothing. Most of the groups that became famous also sort of were discovered in the Two Eyes coffee bar. It had that reputation. And so the band setter was playing, and I saw this chap who I thought, I know his face. And he was looking at me, and then this young lad came over and said, are you anything to do with this band? I said, yes. He said, well, there's this German geezer here, reckons he knows you. And I said, Herr Koschmider. And he said, Herr William, it's like Stanley and Livingstone sort of thing. And my first thought was to get him out of there, because the guy who owned the coffee bar, he had his own bands as well. And so I took him to a coffee bar across the road called Act One, Scene One. But he couldn't speak English. And so eventually we found a German waiter who worked in one of the coffee bars. And he wanted wanted an English band to play in his club. I said, well, why are you here? He said, well, I came a month ago, you told me all your bands were good. But he'd never heard of Liverpool, so he automatically went to the capital, London. And of course, it didn't take him long. And he got a band called Tony Sheridan, who played for him. And Tony Sheridan was a bit of a difficult person, that's putting it mildly, to get on with. And he left after 2 weeks and went to another club to play. And that meant Herr Koschmider had no band. So I fixed him up with Howie Casey. So they were the first group that went over, was Howie Casey. And they became so big over there, and the business was booming. And he had another club called the Indra, which was a striptease club. And he decided to turn that into a rock and roll club. And I thought, well, the Beatles, they're good enough to go over there. And I asked them, I said, would you like to go to Hamburg? He said, yeah, sure, we'd all love to go. But then Tommy Moore, who was the drummer, who was he was about my age actually, he was 10 years older than John. And he wasn't very bright, poor fellow. And if you weren't very bright with John Lennon, you know, he had a scathing tongue, very sarcastic, wicked sense of humor. And Tommy couldn't take it anymore, so he left. So we had another drummer, Norman Chapman, who was very good. And he, unfortunately, we had national conscription in those days, and he was called up to do his army service, so we lost him. And I said, well, I'm afraid you can't go unless we can, you know, come up with a drummer. And then they remembered that they used to play in a little club called the Casbah, which was owned by a Mrs. Best. And they said, yeah, we've got this guy, Pete Best, and we believe he's just bought a new set of drums. I said, well, go and get him. So they got Pete Best. Pete Best auditioned right in this club here. And as far as I'm concerned, I couldn't care less whether he he was a brilliant drummer or not, but he was a reasonable drummer. And so he got the job. And then it came to money to get him over there, because the other band paid the train fares down to Folkestone or so, Dover, somewhere like that. And then they got the train all the way to Hamburg. Beatles, no, they hadn't got a penny between them. In actual fact, it's quite funny this, well, I think it's funny. It was announced in the local paper this week that Paul McCartney is now officially a billionaire. And you're looking at somebody who, the only billionaire, I know, who owes me money. Because they borrowed £15, still got the IOU for it. They owe me 15 quid because they had no gear to go in and that. So I lent them the 15, and then they said, well, we can't afford to pay for the boat and the train, and so I thought, well, I've got the minibus, I'll drive you there. And so I said, okay, we'll all go in a minibus, and it'll cost you £10 each. I'll pay the fares and the boats and the food and everything, and you pay it out of your wages. And so we went to Hamburg with the coach. There were 10 of us in a little minibus, and that included all their equipment. Could you imagine a whole group in one minibus with the speakers and everything? The speakers and the amplifiers were no bigger than a little attache case. So we went over to Hamburg, and we stopped at Arnhem. We walked around Arnhem, and they all went into this musical shop which sold musical instruments. And we came out of the shop, and they all went into bulk laughing. I said, well, you know, what's the joke? John Lennon pulls out a mouth, he'd only stolen a mouth organ from the shop, and I go, gee whiz, we're not even going to make Hamburg, we're all going to finish up in jail, you know. Now this was the first time he'd ever been abroad, so how the hell are we going to get to Hamburg when he's already was shoplifting, you know? Anyway, we got to Hamburg, and we were shown the club, the Indra, and when we went in, it was still a strip club in there. I could see them all drop. Oh my God, we're not backing a striptease artist, are we? Anyway, it was established that this was the last night. So we found them accommodation, or rather the club owner, which was the back of an old cinema. It must have been an old variety theatre, and the dressing rooms at the back were still there, of course. But he hadn't even bothered to clean them. There was about an inch thick dust on the walls and just bunk beds, no water. To get washed, they had to wait till the cinema had finished, you know, and then they'd rush to the toilets and get a wash in the public toilets in the cinema. But then the engagement was for 3 months, but they were doing that well, that was extended for another 2 months. So they'd left Liverpool for 7 months. So much so that when they came back to play in Liverpool, nobody really knew the Beatles because they'd only done a few gigs around the Liverpool area. A fellow called Bob Wooler slotted them in at a place called Little Town Hall because the group didn't turn up. And there was instant Beatlemania started on that very night. The bouncers thought there was a fight because all the girls froze. So, you know, seeing these 5 lads all in their leather gear, all stomping about the stage, and they all rushed to the stage, and the bouncers thought there was a fight, because that's what happens when there's a fight. Everybody rushes to see the fight, and it was the Beatles. And they used to think they were a German band because they were billed. Other promoters above them said, direct from Hamburg. And the girls used to say to Paul, wow, you speak very good English for a German group. They wanted to go back to Hamburg again because they loved Hamburg. But we had problems with this Herr Koschmi there. He had them arrested and they were deported from Germany. He accused them of setting fire to his cinema. Well, all that happened was, when they were getting ready to go to Liverpool, somebody struck a match and It was like a border went round, and they just blackened the wall because it was so filthy, you know, the dust. And so getting them back the second time was tough. But I managed to get them back, and then I got a letter from John Lennon saying they weren't going to pay my commission, which they never paid last time anyway. But they claimed that the cost me there deducted from the wages, and that wasn't their fault. And so I wrote them a letter saying, you appear to be getting more than a little swelled headed now. Remember, I was the only one who took an interest in you. I know you're getting quite famous now, but I'll fix it, that you'll never ever work again. And that terminated my relationship with them. Because I just opened another club called the Blue Angel, which was absolutely swing, and I thought, I don't need this harassment from the Tuttons Halfpenny group. And that's how I come to finish with them.
On August 6th, the Beatles asked Pete Best to be their drummer. With their Saturday night residency at the Grosvenor Ballroom canceled due to local complaints, the Beatles had some time off. On this night, they went to Mona Best's Casbah Coffee Club, where they saw the Blackjacks playing. The group had Mona's son, Pete Best, playing a brand new drum kit. The Blackjacks were on the point of splitting up, so the Beatles suggested to Pete that he join them for their first trip to Hamburg. Best was interested in the proposal and agreed to audition for them on the following Friday.
When they first started appearing at the Cavern Club, there was a guy named Derry Wilkie who had been to Germany, to Hamburg, and he came home and he was walking along Duke Street and he heard the Beatles practicing in the basement of the Jacaranda. And he recognised them as the Beatles because he'd been to see them a few times before he went off to Germany. And he banged on the ground for somebody to come up and open the door for him, and it was Paul McCartney. And of course Paul knew Derry and various other people, like they all know each other, or knew each other. And he said, listen man, he said, you know, I've just come back from Germany, from Hamburg. It's fantastic over there. He said, I want you to, you should get in touch. He said, and here's a phone number for you. And he passed on the phone number of the Kaiser Keller in Hamburg. And he said, if you phone there, you are asked for Mr. Koschmider, I think his name was, Koschmider or Mider, and tell him that you know me, and I would highly recommend you.
Yeah, there's these four guys, as I say, that most of us have not seen before, and they were Stuart Sutcliffe, John, Paul and George. Their drummer evidently couldn't be there because he had a day job. So anyway, we all went on, did our bit for Larry Parnes, and Billy Fury was there, sitting there, sort of watching the various bands. And each band went on in turn, and then eventually came down to this band called the Silver Beatles to do their thing, you know, and they got up and they borrowed the drummer from the Big Three, a guy called Johnny Hutchison, who's one of Liverpool's famous drummers of the time, you know. And they did their thing, and funny enough, you know, they're okay, they were still a bit rough and ready, and but okay. And I remember the bass player, Stuart, didn't face Larry Parnes, he had his back to them, you know? And whether that was a moody or he was a bit ashamed of showing what he was doing on the bass, I don't know.
The second major phase in the Beatles' story was about to begin. On the 16th of August in 1960, they embarked on the journey from Liverpool to Hamburg, Germany. The five members of the Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Stuart Sutcliffe, and Pete Best, along with manager Alan Williams, his wife Beryl, her brother Barry Chang, and friend Lord Woodbine, set off from the Jacaranda Club in Williams' green Austin van. They stopped off in London to pick up a 10th passenger, Herr Steiner, an Austrian working in the Heaven and Hell coffee shop on Old Compton Street, who was to be the Hamburg promoter Bruno Koschmider's interpreter. They then caught the ferry from Harwich to the Netherlands. The party ended up in Arnhem, after Williams took a wrong turn. While there, they were photographed at the War Memorial, spent time wandering around the city, and John Lennon stole a harmonica from a local shop. The Beatles arrived in Hamburg, Germany in the early evening of the 17th of August in 1960 for the first of 48 nights at the Indra Club on the Gross Freiheit Street. The group performed at the venue for 48 nights, ending on October 3rd in 1960. The venue was owned by Bruno Koschmider, a local club owner who also owned the Kaiser Keller. The group's contract was to run for 2 months, from the 17th of August to October 16th. The Beatles were to receive 30 Deutschmarks, which is about £2.50 per person each day, paid every Thursday. Koschmider also paid their manager, Alan Williams, a commission of £10 each week. They were expected to perform for 4.5 hours each weekday night, from 8 to 9:30 p.m., 10 to 11 p.m., 11:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m., and 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. They also had to play for 6 hours on Saturday. The Beatles spent much of December 1960 despondent and with no money, following the disastrous end to their first Hamburg trip. John Lennon was the last to arrive, back in Britain, but spent 5 days alone, before finally contacting the other Beatles on the 15th of December. Paul McCartney, meanwhile, had taken a job in a Liverpool factory. The Beatles ended 1960 with a performance at the Casbah Coffee Club in Hayman's Green, owned by drummer Pete Best's mother, Mona. This was the fourth and final time the Beatles played with stand-in bassist Chas Newby, following Stuart Sutcliffe's decision to stay in Germany with Astrid Kircher. The Beatles played at the Casbah Coffee Club a total of 37 times between 1960 and 1962. The Beatles had given a triumphant homecoming performance at Litherland Town Hall on the 27th of December, 1960, following their first trip to Hamburg. They returned to the venue on this date for a second time. The night was promoted by Brian Kelly, whose BK events took place at halls across northern Liverpool. The Beatles performed at 36 BK engagements between this date and the 11th of March, 1961, several of which were booked immediately after their December show. This was the first time Paul McCartney played bass guitar with the Beatles, as Stuart Sutcliffe had chosen to stay in Hamburg with Astrid Kircher. The Beatles were paid £7.10 for this appearance. In the audience were Johnny Guitar and Ringo Starr from Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, who had returned from Hamburg the day before. The Beatles played a total of 20 shows at Litherland Town Hall. The final one took place on the 9th of November, 1961. Thursday, February 9th, was the first time that the Beatles performed at the Cavern Club. Situated on Matthew Street in central Liverpool, the Cavern had played host to the Quarrymen before. On this day, however, the Beatles made their debut at the venue. The Beatles swiftly became a regular fixture at the Cavern, attracting a loyal audience until their final appearance on the 3rd of August, 1963. For this first show, lasting from 1 to 2 p.m., they were given a £5 fee to share between them. This was George Harrison's first time on the Cavern stage. Harrison arrived in blue jeans, which were banned from the club, but he managed to convince the bouncer, Paddy Delaney, that he was one of the performers. The precise number of the Beatles' Cavern performances is not known, although they played at least 155 lunchtime and 125 evening shows between this date and the 3rd of August 1963. On Monday, the 15th of March in 1961, Stuart Sutcliffe had flown alone to Hamburg. While there, he and his fiancée, Astrid Kircher, cleared some administrative paperwork to enable the Beatles to return to the city to perform. The Beatles had left Hamburg under a cloud in late 1960, after George Harrison was deported for being underage, and Paul McCartney and Pete Best were arrested for alleged arson. Sutcliffe and Kircher paved the way for the group's longest Hamburg residency, 92 nights at the Top 10 Club, which began on April 1, 1961. But first, there was a long train and boat journey from Liverpool to Germany, which began on the 27th of March. The Top 10 Club was owned by Peter Elkhorn, who paid each of the Beatles 35 Deutschmarks, £3 per day. They were required to play from 7 p.m. until 2 a.m. each weekday, and from 8 p.m. until 4 a.m. on weekends, with a 15-minute break in each hour. The performances at the Top 10 were so successful that Elkhorn twice extended the Beatles' contract. They eventually left Germany, following their final show at the club on July 1st, 1961, having performed on stage for 503 hours during their stay. On Thursday, the 22nd of June, the Beatles, under the name Toady Sheraton and the Beat Brothers, recorded their first single, My Bonnie. The Beatles had been approached by orchestral leader and Polydor agent Bert Kaempfert, who wanted them as the backing band for Sheridan. The recording was not done at a professional studio, but a converted stage at Hamburg's Friedrich Ebert Hall.
We started off in a place called the Kaiserkeller, then we went to the Top 10, and then the Star Club happened. But we were all together right at the beginning in the Kaiserkeller. Beatles as well, and many other groups, of course.
The Beatles and Sheridan recorded 4 songs over 2 consecutive days: My Bonnie, The Saints, Why, and Cry for Shadow. The latter was an instrumental, whereas the others all featured Sheridan on vocals.
Lies over the ocean. My Bonnie lies over the sea. My Bonnie lies over the ocean. Bring back my Bonnie to me. Last night as I lay on my pillow, that night as I lay on the bed, that night as I lay on my pillow, you know I had a little dream that my Bonnie was dead. Boy, my Bonnie today to me. Mama, why don't you bring it on back? Oh, Mama, won't you bring it on back? Bring it back, my Bonnie to me. A little bit of Holly Cases, come on, my bro. about gone ahead of me.
Basically, that's we wanted to do rock and roll, you see, and the first thing, My Bonnie, we did was a hit in Germany, and of course it's still selling all around the world because of them. But then we should have followed it up with something really rocking.
Well, it actually began, I went to Hamburg to play at the Top 10 Club, and I went into the Top 10 Club following the Beatles. They were finishing off their period of time. I'm not sure how long they were playing there, but I went in there and I met Paul and John and George outside the Top 10 Club. They were packing their gear into a van, and they came over and introduced themselves because at that time I was doing a regular TV show in England, Drumbeat and Oh Boy. And these were regular TV shows that were every Saturday night. And unbeknownst to me, that Paul McCartney was a Little Richard fan, and I was kind of known as England's Little Richard. When the Beatles were billed in the very, very early days, I remember in '61 they were billed as just straight from Hamburg, because while they were trying to make a name for themselves, when they were going to play in Hamburg, they'd be in Hamburg for up to 6 weeks, 2 months at a time. They'd come back and their image was changing. From jeans, they were going into the leather trousers and leather jackets, and the hair was starting to come down. And a lot of the local people thought this band from Germany are fantastic. Don't they speak English well? They actually thought they were a German band. And the Beatles from Germany was the way they were getting billed all the time. And of course from the Silver Beatles, then changed to the Beatles. But the local people just adored them some way because the Beatles were trying to be different. And I think Liverpool, even right up to this day, people in Liverpool love you if you don't follow any trends, if you want to try and be your own style. And the Beatles just didn't follow any trends. While everyone was trying to be Cliff Richard or Elvis, they just wanted to be the Beatles and play hard rock and roll. That was it.
They were playing at Latham Hall, which is the Brian Kelly show. And after the show, the girls had been eyeing the Beatles up, which they always did, you know. And one or two of them were eyeing Stuart up because he was so shy, you know. And this gang, the boyfriends of the girls, you know, followed the band outside. And one of them attacked Stuart, knocked him over and kicked him in the head. John came running out and hit him to follow that hard. John couldn't play the guitar for 2 weeks. They sprained his wrist, you know. And that was one of the few times I wasn't there. I got told by one of the people who had followed the band around a lot, and he said John was crying that night. Well, I firmly believe that's where Stuart got his tumour from. It didn't come out till probably 2 years later, you know.
Thursday, the 6th of July, sees the launch of the Mercy Beat magazine. Bill Harry, a student at the Liverpool College of Art, published the first edition of Mercy Beat magazine. The fortnightly magazine quickly became an essential read for fans of the Liverpool music scene. The Beatles appeared numerous times in its pages. Harry, a friend to John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe, was a keen writer. However, his attempts to interest the national press in the burgeoning Liverpool music scene came to nothing. Saturday, the 28th of October, Raymond Jones walks into Nem's record shop and orders My Bonnie. Nem's was owned by entrepreneur Brian Epstein. It is unlikely that Epstein had never heard of the Beatles until he met with Jones. The group was regularly featured in the Liverpudlian music publication Mercy Beat, which Epstein sold in Nem's and wrote record reviews for. Although he had little interest in the actual content, he could hardly have failed to notice the leather-clad group which had taken Hamburg by storm. Epstein's curiosity was nonetheless piqued after his encounter with the enthusiastic Jones. And on Thursday, the 9th of November, 1961, he and Taylor paid their first visit to the Cavern Club to watch the Beatles perform. It was the beginning of a chain of events that would irrevocably change the lives of the people involved and cause a revolution in popular culture. Epstein and Taylor entered the band's dressing room, which was only as big as a broom cupboard after the show. The Beatles recognized Epstein, with George Harrison opening the conversation by asking, "And what brings Mr. Epstein here?" Epstein watched the Beatles at the Cavern Club several times over the next few weeks. On the 10th of December, he suggested becoming the band's manager. They signed a 5-year management contract on the 24th of January in 1962. On the evening of the 9th in November, however, the Beatles performed for the final time at Liverpool's slightly down-at-heel Litherland Town Hall Ballroom. Monday, January 1st, 1962, was the date that the Beatles auditioned for Decca Records. The session followed the label's A&R representative, Mike Smith's attendance at a Cavern performance on the 13th of December. The Beatles' performance that night hadn't been strong enough to secure them a record deal, but the label was willing to offer them a session in their studios at 165 Broadhurst Gardens, West Hampstead, London. Since taking over management of the Beatles, Brian Epstein had his sights set further afield from shows in the clubs of Liverpool. He wanted the group to perform in more reputable ballrooms and theaters, to appear on television and radio, and to secure a recording contract. On the 10th of January, 1962, he visited the BBC's Manchester headquarters to complete a 3-page application for an audition by the Variety department. The hope was that he could get the Beatles an audition before radio producers, who would then call on them to perform on their shows. Epstein's application was approved, and the Beatles traveled to the BBC, Piccadilly, Manchester, to play before Peter Pilbeam, a producer for radio shows aimed at teenagers, made in the northwest of England, but broadcast throughout the nation. The Beatles played 4 songs, Like Dreamers Do, Till There Was You, Memphis, Tennessee, and Hello Little Girl. The first 2 were sung by Paul McCartney, with John Lennon taking vocals on the latter 2. On the 7th of March in 1962, the Beatles recorded their radio debut at the Playhouse Theatre, Home, Manchester. The recording was for the show Teenagers' Turn, Here We Go. The band rehearsed their set from 3:45 p.m. in the evening, wearing suits for the very first time. The Beatles performed 3 cover versions: Dream Baby, How Long Must I Dream, Memphis, Tennessee, and Please Mr. Postman. Together with the other 3 acts also appearing on the program, the recording took place between 8 and 8:45 p.m. On the 10th of April, Stuart Sutcliffe, ex-Beatles bass guitarist in their early period, died of a brain hemorrhage. He'd been suffering from increasingly severe headaches and blackouts since settling in Hamburg with Astrid Kircher, his German fiancée. The cause of these remained uncertain, though Sutcliffe believed they were a consequence of overwork. On April 11th, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and Pete Best flew out of Manchester destined for Germany for their first residency at the Star Club in Hamburg. George Harrison was unwell at the time, so he flew to Germany the following day with the Beatles manager Brian Epstein. Lennon, McCartney, and Best were met at the airport in Hamburg by Astrid Kircher to tell them the devastating news. June 6 was the date of the Beatles' first visit to EMI Studios at 3 Abbey Road, St. John's Wood, London. The session took place in Studio 2 from 7 to 10 p.m. The Beatles first ran through several songs and then recorded 4. Precise numbers of takes are unknown, but they were taped in the following order: Bésame Mucho, Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, and Ask Me Why. August 15th was Pete Best's final show with the Beatles. This was the Beatles' 91st evening show at the Cavern Club. It was also the 38th occasion on which they performed both lunchtime and evening shows at the venue. More significantly, it was Pete Best's final show with the Beatles, 2 years and 3 days after he first performed with them. The Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, asked Best to come to the NEMS office the following day, although the drummer failed to see anything unusual in the request.
Sort of clash of personalities. The boys, the Beatles, well, they've been over here several times, and to me they seem to have a say in everything that happens, I would have imagined. I don't know them that well.
Well, I think they've always been like that, not just since Brian has taken them over. They've always been like that. They've always sort of had a little bit to say. But from the point of clash of personalities, well, probably that may be it, because Peter did have a terrific fan club, compared to the others.
It's too good looking, perhaps, eh?
Well, I'll leave that for the other people to say, but from my point of view, we haven't come here to sort of throw any sticks and stones at the boys, because there is no really hard feeling. There was at first, but as I say, success is hard to come by, and these things do happen. But it's just the way that it was done that has annoyed us, that's all. If it had been done a bit more straightforward, it would have been more to the mark.
I've forgotten about it now, I don't know what they have.
Yeah.
But the way I look at it, just let it lie now. Except for the reports in the papers, and it gets me a bit niggled at times.
They keep going having a go at you, do they?
Yeah,
What do they say mainly?
Well, drummer wasn't too good, the beat wasn't so hot,
How do you get on with Ringo? Do you talk to Ringo?
Well, I haven't seen Ringo for donkeys years. I used to be good mates of his, before the replacement took place. We're still mates now, but I haven't seen him to have a chat with him or anything like that.
Pete Best was probably the best looking of the bunch. He was very quiet with a sullen kind of charm.
Pete initially in Liverpool was the most popular member of the Beatles, particularly with the girl fans. And whenever the Beatles used to appear, all the girls used to shout and scream for Pete.
But he couldn't play drums very well. He couldn't keep in time too well. And I was aware that the band weren't tight. They needed that sort of binding force that a good drummer should give them. So I said to Brian, well, I'll get another drummer for the recording sessions. You can do what you like with him on stage, but we'll have someone else on the tracks. And I didn't realize until afterwards that they'd been thinking the same thing anyway.
Following the sacking of Pete Best, the Beatles were quick to recruit their new drummer. Ringo Starr wasn't a stranger to the band, having stood in for them on several occasions in Hamburg and Liverpool, where he primarily played for Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. Ringo first played on the same bill as the Beatles on the 13th of March in 1959, on the opening night of the Morgue Skiffle Cellar in Liverpool. He was playing with Al Caldwell's Texans, and further down the bill were the Quarrymen. Caldwell later became Rory Storm. The Quarrymen, of course, were to become the Beatles.
I think one of the biggest changes I do remember from the Beatles was when Pete Best was given the sack. We were actually invited along to see Brian Epstein at the time. He just signed the Mezzabit up, so we went along to the office, and Pete Best was walking out of the office as we were going in with a very long face. We said hello to him, he completely ignored us and walked past. And we found out later that Brian had said to him, I'm afraid we're bringing a new drummer in, we're bringing Ringo Starr in. But if you want to stay in the business, I suggest that you join the Mersey Beats. Well, he turned that down by saying, I'm not going to join those little kids. But as it happened, we wouldn't have had Pete anyway, because we were quite happy with John Banks, who was our drummer at the time. Quite happy. But I did notice a great change in the band then. And after that, we went along, we appeared with them at the Cavern the next day. And I remember they were doing a lunchtime session, and as they turned up, George had been assaulted outside. This was to do the first show with Ringo Starr. And George came in with a big black eye, and we said, what's happened to you? And he said, they're all taking it out on me. He said, they're frightened to take it out on John, because he'll flatten them, so they've all picked on me. They've all punched me. He said, it's my fault for throwing Pete Best out, because Pete Best had such a legion of fans. He was possibly the most popular at the very early days, because he was so good looking and so handsome and very quiet, and he had all the girls screaming for him at the time. But I think the sound changed as soon as Ringo joined the band. To me, it was slightly different. He did a different bass drum pattern. Pete was a lot simpler, a lot heavier player. And to me, they went more to an all-round band than the heavy rock and roll as they started off with. I mean, as it happened, they went from strength to strength then, but I think the sound somehow wasn't quite the same.
I remember one event where it sort of changed, and I realised the Beatles are going to make it. I mean, from day one I knew they were going to make it. I just knew they were going to do something. I didn't know how big they were going to be, but I knew they were going to be big, not just around Liverpool, not just around Merseyside. One of the first reasons for me saying that is I remember them coming back from, Ringo joined them by then, and they'd been to record, and it was the follow-up to Love Me Do, it was Please Please Me, and they changed it quite a bit. They wrote it initially as a Roy Orbison type of song, you know, like last night I said these words to my girl, one of those, you know. And they came back with a new interpretation of it, faster, Paul singing a top melody over John, and George coming in with Paul doing the backing vocals, and it just blew me away. And I remember getting shivers down me. They were playing it live, the new version of it, live on the Cavern, around the corner from here. And I just said, oh my God, that's it, that's the one, that's going to be #1 all over the world. And to make a bold statement like that, which I did to myself and to friends as well, as a 15-year-old boy, was something else, you know. But I realised then that they were going to do it. It was just the way they changed it. It was just an immediate #1 record.
On Thursday, August 23rd, John Lennon marries Cynthia Powell at the Mount Pleasant Register Office in Liverpool. Brian Epstein was the best man, and George Harrison and Paul McCartney were also in attendance. Absent was John's Aunt Mimi, who disapproved of the union, although Cynthia's half-brother and his wife were there. Tuesday, September 4th, the Beatles record How Do You Do It and Love Me Do. Following the Beatles' first session for EMI on the 6th of June 1962, they returned for a second attempt at recording their debut single. This was Ringo Starr's first recording session with the group. In the morning, the group had flown down from Liverpool Airport. They checked into a hotel in Chelsea and arrived at Abbey Road shortly after midday. Before the recording session, the Beatles undertook a rehearsal, overseen by EMI's Ron Richards, during which they repeatedly ran through 6 songs. 2 of these, Love Me Do and How Do You Do It, were chosen to be recorded by the group. The rehearsal lasted between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. During it, they also played a slower, bluesy version of Please Please Me, which featured George Harrison playing the main motif throughout the song. On September 11th, following their studio session of September 4th, the Beatles recorded How Do You Do It and Love Me Do. EMI hastily arranged for them to return to London for a third attempt to complete their debut single. The session, which lasted from 5 p.m. to 6:45 p.m., was produced by Ron Richards, although George Martin arrived halfway through. Ringo Starr was relegated to playing the maracas on a remake of P.S. I Love You and tambourine on Love Me Do. George Martin was concerned with the quality of Ringo Starr's drumming on the original Love Me Do, and so arranged for an experienced session drummer, Andy White, to play on the session. White was paid a standard fee of £5.15.
Brian Epstein walked into my office one day and said he got a group that he wanted me to hear. Brian had apparently taken one of his tapes into the EMI store in Oxford Street to get it transferred to disc. And the engineer heard it and thought it was very good. Brian told him how he'd been to every record company in the country and hadn't gotten anywhere with it. And he saw me because I had a reputation at that time for being rather screwball and rebellious, and I would take any nutty thing like the Beatles. The music wasn't frightfully original. There were no great songs there. It was just the sound was interesting. I arranged a recording test with them in Abbey Road, No. 3 studio, which meant I was going to spend a couple of hours with them finding out what they could do. They had a very, very funny version of Please Please Me, which was rather slow. They did have Love Me Do. Weird things like Fat Swallows Your Feet's Too Big or Till There Was You. I got them to sing lots of different things to find out which voice was good. I was looking for the Cliff Richard or the Elvis Presley or the Tommy Steele, saying, now, is Paul going to be the main one or is John going to be the main one? And George, well, he's obviously not got such a good voice as the other two. And then it suddenly hit me right between the eyes. Why the hell should I find a solo singer? Why not just have the lot of them as they are? It wasn't their music that sold them to me. It was their charm. They were very charming people.
On Monday, the 1st of October, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and their manager Brian Epstein signed their first and only contract as the Beatles with this lineup. It replaced an earlier contract that had been signed by the group's previous drummer, Pete Best. Ringo Starr signed the contract under his real name, Richard Starkey, and the fathers of George Harrison and Paul McCartney also signed the contract, as the pair were under 21 and needed parental consent. Under the terms of the contract, Epstein agreed to undertake all necessary advertising and publicity for the artists, and to advise the artists on all matters concerning clothes, makeup, and the presentation and construction of the artists' acts in return for 25% of the group's earnings, as long as they made more than £200 per week each. The Beatles and Epstein signed the contract at Epstein's office at Nems in Whitechapel, Liverpool, 4 days before the release of their first single, Love Me Do. The signing was witnessed by Epstein's secretary, Beryl Adams. The contract was sold at auction in London in 2008 for £240,000, and again in 2015 for £265,000. That's $553,121.
I hadn't had anything to do with pop management of pop artists before that day that I went down to the Cavern Club and heard the Beatles playing. And this was quite a new world, really, for me. I was amazed by this sort of dark, smoky, dank atmosphere, this beat music playing away. And the Beatles were then just four lads on that rather dimly lit stage, somewhat ill-clad, and the presentation was, well, left little to be desired as far as I was concerned, because I've been interested in the theatre and acting a long time. But amongst all that, something tremendous came over, and I was immediately struck by their music, their beat, and their sense of humour, actually, on stage. And even afterwards, when I met them, I was struck again by their personal charm. And it was there that really it all started. It took about 8 months to get to the stage where we had a recording contract and we were having the first record issued. And from there to the present, well, where their last record sold 500,000 copies within 10 days of issue. Actually, their first record did very well. It sold 100,000 copies. That was Love Me Do.
The best thing was it came to the charts in 2 days. And everybody thought it was a fiddle because our managers' stores send in these, record things? Returns. And everybody down south thought, he's buying them himself, or he's just filling the charge, you know. But he wasn't.
Actually, we've been at it a long time before that. We've been to Hamburg. I think that's where we found our style. We developed our style because of this fellow there. He used to say, hey, you've got to make a show for the people. And he used to come up every night shouting, Mac Show. So we used to Mac Show, and John used to dance around like a gorilla, and we'd all, you know, knock our heads together and things like that. Anyway, we got back to Liverpool, and all the groups there were doing this sort of shadows type of stuff. And we came back, leather jackets and jeans and funny hair, macking show, which went down quite well.
We just bought leather jackets, not for the group. One person bought one, I can't remember, and then we all liked them, so it ended up we were all on stage with them. We'd always worn jeans because we didn't have anything else at the time, yeah. And then we went back to Liverpool and got quite a few bookings, you know, they all thought we were German. You know, we had builders from Hamburg, and they all said, you speak good English, you know, things like that. So we went back to Germany, and we had a bit more money the second time. So we bought leather pants, and we looked like 4 Gene Vincents, only a bit younger, I think. And that was it, you know, and we just kept those, the leather gear, till Brian came along.
It was a bit sort of old hat anyway, all wearing leather gear. And we decided we didn't want to look sort of ridiculous, just going on, because more often than not, sort of too many people would laugh. It was just stupid. We didn't want to appear as a gang of idiots. And Brian suggested that we just sort of wore ordinary suits. So we just got what we thought were quite good suits, and just got rid of the leather gear. That was all.
So you had yours pinched anyway?
Oh yeah, I had my pants pinched
We
anyway.
didn't laugh at them in Liverpool.
We do like the fans and enjoy reading the publicity about us, but from time to time you don't realise that it's actually about yourself. You see your pictures and read articles about, you know, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Paul and John. But you don't actually think, oh, that's me, that I am in the paper. It's funny, it's just as though it's a different person.
When we go home, you know, we go in early in the morning when we finish the job, and the kids, you know, they don't know you at home. But if they find out, well, where I live, they get the drums out, you know, and beat it out, because it's a play street, and, you know, there's no traffic or nothing bothering them. And once, when the boys came for me, they popped in to see my mum and my dad, you know. We had to go out the back because, you know, there's 20 or 30 outside. And they wouldn't believe me, mother, you know, they'd knock in saying, can we have the autographs? So it built up, you know, so much. There was about 200 kids all around the door, and they was peeping through the window and knocking, you know. In the end, my mother was ill, you know, she was terrified out of her life, just all these kids and boys and girls and that, you know.
They send us a lot of jelly babies and chocolates and things like that, because somebody wrote in one of the papers about presents and things that we've had given to us, and John said he got some jelly babies, and I ate them. But ever since that, we've been inundated. We had about 2 ton a night. But the main trouble is they tend to throw them at us when we're on stage. And once I got one in my eye, which wasn't very nice. In fact, I've never been the same since.
It all sounds complaining that, you know, we're not. We're just putting the point, is it, you know, it affects your home more than it does yourself, you know, because you know what to expect for your parents and your family, you know.
The Beatles' debut single was released on the 5th of October in 1962. Love Me Do reached number 17 in the charts, which was a strong showing for a band's first release. Although they re-recorded the single with session drummer Andy White on September 11th, initial copies of the single carried the recording of Love Me Do from their early September 4th session. When EMI came to release the 1963 EP The Beatles Hits, it was decided that the version featuring White was the best, and the master recording featuring Ringo's drumming was destroyed. Sales of Love Me Do / P.S. I Love You were strongest in the Liverpool area. There were strong rumors that Brian Epstein bought 10,000 copies of the single to improve its chart ranking. While quite possibly true, these were never proven to be true. 4 days later, they had no publicity or live engagements, but chose to visit London journalists. They first visited the offices of Record Mirror, where they attempted to encourage the editorial team to feature the single. This was followed by a visit to Alan Smith, a Liverpudlian journalist on the New Musical Express. Smith asked the Beatles what they thought of Londoners, and he received the reply, "Not much. If they know you come from the North, they don't want to know." Attitudes would swiftly change once the Beatles found nationwide success. At 8:45 p.m. on Saturday the 27th, before their fourth and final live appearance at the Home Hall in Birkenhead, the Beatles recorded a radio interview for Radio Clatterbridge. It is the group's earliest surviving recorded interview. The station served 2 local hospitals, Cleaver and Clatterbridge. The Beatles were interviewed by Monty Lister, with additional questions from Malcolm Threadgill and Peter Smethurst. Lister presented 2 shows on the Radio Clatterbridge, Music with Monty and Sunday Spin. The Beatles had little experience to draw from. Just 3 weeks had passed since the release of Love Me Do, and much of the interview was spent establishing basic information about the group. John Lennon spoke of working on Please Please Me, in the hope that it would become their second single, and Paul McCartney notably described Lennon as the Beatles' leader. On the 30th of October, the Beatles flew from Liverpool to Hamburg, on this day ahead of their second residency at Hamburg's Star Club, situated on Groy Freiheit off the Reeperbahn. They were contracted to play for 14 consecutive nights at the venue, from the 1st to the 14th of November in 1962. Although they didn't know it at the time, by the end of the year their lives would be turned upside down. They would be famous all across the United Kingdom and elsewhere, and their singles and albums would have sold into the millions.
It was in this tiny council house, number 174 Mackett's Lane, that the youngest member of the Beatles, George Harrison, lived. His father was a bus driver, and the family lived here until 1965, when the pressure of fame forced them to move to a house in nearby Warrington that George bought for his father. In stark contrast to the relative prosperity of the areas where John, Paul and George grew up, Richard Starkey, Ringo Starr, was born here in the working class heart of Liverpool, the Dingle, at number 9 Madryn Street. This house that heard Ringo Starr's first newborn cries is now derelict, the windows boarded up. Even the original door is gone, and they've replaced it with a second-hand door. Ringo lived here for 6 years, until his mother, to take advantage of lower rents, swapped this house with a friend and moved across the way to Admiral Grove.
Has Ringo suggested you should stop work as a Liverpool Corporation painter?
He certainly has, but I don't want to move. I like my job and I like the people I work with. They've been really wonderful to me.
Has Ringo's affluence made any difference to you at all?
No, not in a way. I'm happy for him, like, that what he's doing, like, he's got security for the rest of his life. And we're quite happy about it, the wife and I.
Mrs. Starkey, does Ringo want to move house?
I don't really think so. He's asked us to have another house, but we're quite happy, and the neighbours and everybody's very good and proud that the boys have got to where they are.
Will the neighbours not become envious of all the wealth that's been accumulated by the Beatles?
No, not the neighbours around here. They're all very good and all quite proud.
Ringo lived here at number 10 Admiral Grove from the age of 6 until he found fame and fortune with the Beatles. The pub on the corner, the Empress, appeared on the album cover of his first solo album, Sentimental Journeys. And Ringo's stepfather and his mother clung on to this house until the fan power pushed them out.
Friday, January 11th, the Beatles' second single was their first to reach number 1. That is, according to some charts. Back in the day, there was no official single source for chart placings. On some, including New Musical Express and Melody Maker, Please Please Me made the top spot. In others, it only managed number 2. Regardless of the true chart placing, the release of Please Please Me had a key effect on the Beatles' career. It put them firmly in the big league. Although Beatlemania was still some ways away, it established them as a household name and ensured they would record a long player for EMI. On Monday, February 11th, the Beatles recorded 10 songs for their debut album Please Please Me at EMI's Abbey Road Studios in London. 3 sessions took place during the day, with the recording finishing at 10:45 p.m. Only 2 had originally been scheduled, but the third was added later on. On Friday, March 22nd, the Beatles' album Please Please Me is released. The disc went on to overtake all rivals when it bounced into the coveted #1 slot. By April 5th, the Beatles received their first silver disc. On April 8th, Julian Lennon is born. However, the Beatles' heavy work schedule meant that John Lennon was unable to see his wife and son until Thursday, April 11th. Saturday, May 18th, the Beatles tour with Roy Orbison. On May 27th, the Beatles' first concert in Cardiff, Wales, took place during their UK tour with Roy Orbison. They performed at the city's Capitol Cinema. Also on the bill, in order of appearance, were the Terry Young Six, Ian Crawford, Lewis Cordet, David Macbeth, Jerry and the Pacemakers, comedian Erky Grant, and Roy Orbison. The Beatles were the headline act and were paid £100 for the appearance. They performed a 7-song set. Some Other Guy, Do You Want to Know a Secret, Love Me Do, From Me to You, Please Please Me, I Saw Her Standing There, and Twist and Shout. With the success of the Beatles looking assured, and expectations for better things as their fame grew across the United Kingdom, Brian Epstein formed the Beatles Limited to handle their legal and business affairs on the 20th of June. Although much of their business continued to be handled by NEMS Enterprises, the new company was a partnership which allowed each of the Beatles to have a specified stake in their success and to ensure lower rates of corporate tax. The Beatles Ltd. Was replaced in April 1967 with the formation of the Beatles and Company, which was later to become Apple Corps. On July 1st, the Beatles recorded both sides of their 4th UK single, She Loves You, I'll Get You, which was released on the 23rd of August in 1963. The group began recording at 5 p.m. at Abbey Road Studio 2 and finished at 10 p.m., although the session had been booked for 2:30 to 5:30 p.m. The 2 songs worked on were She Loves You and I'll Get You, the latter under its working title Get You in the End. Also in July, the Beatles completed, in under 8 hours, 18 songs for 3 editions of the radio show Pop Go the Beatles. At the BBC Paris studio in London, they rehearsed and recorded the songs along with between the song banter. The shows were broadcast on the BBC Light program on the 6th, the 13th, and the 20th of August in 1963. These were later released as the BBC sessions. On the 30th of July, the Beatles recorded Money, Till There Was You, Roll Over Beethoven, It Won't Be Long, and All My Loving. This was the Beatles' second EMI session of the day. The first had ended so the group could record an interview and radio session for the BBC. The evening session began at 5 p.m. and finished at 11 p.m., an hour later than scheduled. On Saturday, the 3rd of August, after nearly 300 performances at Liverpool's Cavern Club, this was the Beatles' final show at the venue. It was well known that the Beatles had outgrown the Cavern by this time, and their regular fans were grudgingly aware that their popularity could only be served by bigger venues.
This is where it all began, and for me this is where the century is going to end with me playing rock and roll, which, if you remember, the Beatles, before the Beatles, was a fabulous little rock and roll band. That was what held us together for so long and made us so good, I think, he said modestly. But I'm back here because I love Liverpool. No more fantastic place to rock out the century. Thank you very much for coming. God bless everybody.
If there was any doubt that the Beatles were a bona fide UK phenomenon by August 1963, the release of their 4th single went beyond all expectations. The songs were recorded on the 1st of July in 1963. She Loves You, with its B-side I'll Get You, was the Beatles' first single to sell more than 1 million copies in Britain. The single entered the charts on the 31st of August and remained there for 31 consecutive weeks. It reached #1 on the 14th of September, remained there for a month, and returned on the 30th of November. The Beatles had rare days off, but on the 9th and 10th of September in 1963, John Lennon and Paul McCartney did have one engagement. They attended a luncheon of the Variety Club of Great Britain. The luncheon took place at the Savoy Hotel in London. Lennon and McCartney received the award for Top Vocal Group of the Year, a sure sign that the Beatles were rapidly becoming establishment figures. The Variety Club was the UK branch of Variety, the children's charity, which raises money for disadvantaged children. It has had strong links with the world of show business.
I think somebody's got to say a word.
It's very nice indeed to get, especially to get one each, because we usually have a bit of trouble cutting them in four. I'd just like to say thank you very much. It's a great honour.
Thank you. Now, Paul.
Same goes for me. Thank you very much for giving us this Silver Heart. But I still think you should have given one to good old Mr. Wilson.
Ringo. Anyone who knows us knows I'm the one that never speaks, so I'd just like to say thanks a lot. I'd just like to say the same as the others. Thanks for the Purple Hearts. Silver! Oh, yeah. Sorry about that, Harold. We'd like to sincerely thank you all, and we've got to go now because the fella on the film wants us, and he says it's costing him a fortune. Thank you.
The group did not slow down. On October 1st, they recorded I Wanna Be Your Man and Little Child. On October the 4th, the Beatles performed 3 songs during their first of 3 appearances on Ready, Steady, Go. The Beatles mimed Twist and Shout, I'll Get You, and She Loves You, and were interviewed by Dusty Springfield. The episode was transmitted from 6:15 p.m. to 7 p.m. Although the Beatles' popularity had been growing steadily and to increasingly frantic heights through 1963, their appearance at the London Palladium on Sunday the 13th of October catapulted them into the attentions of the mainstream media, who coined the term Beatlemania to describe the scenes of screaming fans. The Beatles' third UK EP was a collection of 4 songs taken from their debut album Please Please Me. It was released, like all the group's UK output so far, on the EMI subsidiary label Parlophone. Monday, November 4th was the night the Beatles appeared at the Royal Command performance at the Prince of Wales Theatre in London, in the presence of the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret. By this point, Beatlemania was an established phenomenon, with the group drawing large, huge, and frenzied audiences across the country and beyond. This was followed by numerous TV appearances over the next few months, and beyond now they have become the world's #1 pop group. The Beatles' 5th UK single was an instant smash, with pre-orders of more than 1 million copies. The Beatles ended 1963 and started 1964 with their Christmas show. Starting from December 24th and going through to January 11th, the Beatles made their debut on the television show Val Parnell's Sunday Night at the London Palladium on the 13th of October in 1963. 3 months later, they made their return on January 12th. The difference in the Beatles' profile between then and now was huge, illustrated not least by their fee having gone from £250 to £1,000. Following their first night of performances at the Olympia Theatre in Paris, the Beatles on January 16th arrived back at the Hotel George V, where they were told that I Want to Hold Your Hand had reached #1 in America. Meet the Beatles, the band's first LP on Capitol Records, was released in America on the 20th of January in 1964. It came out while the Beatles were in Paris. Please Please Me had first been released as a single in America on the 25th of February in 1963. But had failed to make an impact. The cash-in on the success of I Want to Hold Your Hand, and in anticipation of the Beatles' first US visit, Vijay re-released the single. On the 7th of February 1964, the Beatles' American invasion began. The band's Boeing 707 Pan Am Flight 101 left London Airport, early bound for New York City.
Any doubts about the Beatles' reception in America were dispelled the moment they touched down. New Yorkers turned out in force, and making allowance for an American accent, the screams might have been genuine Merseyside. George, John, Paul and Ringo had found a new world to conquer. Some press conference. For half an hour there was so much din you couldn't tell a word. It was a matter of everybody being patient, hoping it would begin eventually.
Anyway, we wrote off. No! Sorry.
Next question.
No, we need money first.
How much money do you expect to take out of this country?
Nothing.
Half a crown.
$10.
Sorry, I know anyway they can tell us what they think they have. How many are bald if you have to wait on stage?
All of us. I'm bald. Oh, we're all bald. Don't tell anyone, please. I'm deaf and dumb, too. I'm deaf from America.
You guys are far along.
Aren't you afraid of what the American Barbers Association is going to think of you? Well, we've grown quicker than the English ones. We'll have a go in. Did you hope to get a haircut at all? No. Nope. No. I had one yesterday. That's no lie. No, I think he missed. No. No, he didn't. No. You should have seen him the day before.
The crowds had waited outside to cheer them all the way to the hotel. No arguing about it. The Beatles are the top pop music phenomenon of the century.
The 9th of February 1964 was the date that the Beatles' record-breaking first live appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show took place at Studio 50 in New York City. 73 million people were reported to have watched the first show. It is still supposed to be one of the largest viewing audiences ever in the U.S.
When they arrived in America, and how come 73 million people were watching for an unknown band? No, what had happened was that the Beatles had started to have their success a little earlier. It was in late November 1963 that there was a TV news report that came to America that was going to be shown. Unfortunately, that evening was Friday, November 22nd, which is the day JFK was shot. So, and after that tragedy, they took the film clip of the Beatles and put it on the shelf. Thought, well, we can't show this now. 18 days later, Walter Cronkite said he was trying to cheer up the American nation after this tragedy. He said, hang on, didn't we have something light-hearted we can show to people? Yeah, we got that clip of those weird guys from England with the funny hair. Why don't we put that on? It'll cheer people up. And that is why 3 weeks later when they land here, there's already Beatlemania.
What did you most like about the trip, Ringo?
Oh, I just loved all of it, you know, especially Miami. The sun, you know. I didn't know what it meant until I went over there.
Don't you get it up in Liverpool?
No, they finished up there, you know. Cut it out.
Did you ever have a chance, John, to just get away on your own without anybody recognising you?
We borrowed a couple of millionaires' houses, you know.
Well, we did. You could afford to buy a couple of millionaires' houses, couldn't you?
No, yeah, we'll sooner borrow them, it's cheaper. And we did a bit of water skiing. Well, sort of, anyway.
Yeah, we had a great time.
Did your wife enjoy it over there?
Yeah, she loved it. Who?
Don't tell him he's married, it's a secret.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to. What about the taste of the fans over there? Did you find the same stuff?
You never been.
Yeah. We expected them to be very different, but they weren't at all.
Yeah.
The accent was the only thing, you know, it was the only difference. Lovely.
Did they reckon you sang in an English accent or American?
No, some fella said, how come because you're from Britain and you still sing an American accent or something?
So
funny. We've been trying to explain to him that it's a Liverpool accent.
You know, but he wouldn't believe it.
He kept saying, oh, it's funny.
When you came back from France, you told me that they liked the sort of quicker numbers.
Yeah.
But what did you do? You just do all the same routine as you do here?
Yes,
because the records that are hits over there are the ones that are hits.
Oh yeah,
over
we had
here.
to do Please Please Me over there.
Yeah.
And we haven't been doing that for a long time here, but it's in the charts.
That's history here.
Yeah.
What about the Beatles styles, all these wigs and suits and things? Are they catching on over
Yeah, they're selling well.
I hear anyway that the four of you are going to be millionaires by the end of the year.
Oh, that's nice.
Have you got time? Have you got time to actually spend this money?
What money? He said.
Doesn't he give any to you?
No. You seen that car of his?
You're fired. One of the things you did was visit Clay. What's...
No,
I'm sorry. One of the things you did was visit
Spitting on me.
Cassius Clay.
He's a big lad.
Who's going to win? Clay Liston.
Ringo.
I'll win him.
Well,
it all depends, you see. If you go to his gym, you have to say he wins. And if you go to Liston's gym, you say Liston will win.
Yeah.
The big lad, Jim will
win.
Big
I think
monsters.
Liston will win, but Cassius Clay is a good singer.
He's a good singer.
He told us, yeah, he's Chubby Checker's cousin.
He made up a poem as well.
Yeah.
This one of the things that have been reported over here in the British Embassy. What actually happened in Washington at this place?
Well, we just sort of went. Excuse me. We just went up to this sort of embassy party given by this lord. And
the British ambassador.
Davy. He was a lord, isn't he?
Davy.
Lord. Oh, lord. Well, and we went up to his house, and there was it was a bit hectic, you know, and we judged the bingo or something.
But what about this business of somebody coming up and cutting your hair?
Oh, it was him.
Tell them about it. Whereabouts?
At the back, can you see? Look how short it is now.
It's a terrible loss.
I know. Oh my God!
Were you short?
No. I just looked down and you just saw all the faces.
On Monday, the 2nd of March, 1964, the Beatles joined Equity, the actors' union, only minutes before they began shooting their first film, the as yet untitled A Hard Day's Night. Their union memberships were proposed and seconded by Wilfrid Brambell and Norman Rosington, their main co-stars in the film, a movie which also starred Victor Spinetti, who would later appear in every Beatles film thereafterwards. Friday, March 20th, in between filming Hard Day's Night, was the second of 3 performances given by the Beatles for the hugely popular 1960s television show Ready, Steady, Go. Saturday, March 28th, London Waxworks Museum Madame Tussauds unveiled life-size figures of all 4 Beatles. They were the first pop group to be immortalized in the museum. April 10th saw the follow-up to the Meet the Beatles. The Beatles' second album was their 3rd long player in the United States, if Introducing the Beatles, released by Vijay in January 1964, is included. The Capitol album contains songs from 4 different UK releases, with the Beatles, Thank You Girl from the From Me to You single, both sides of She Loves You / I'll Get You, and You Can't Do That from the Can't Buy Me Love single. 2 new songs, Long Tall Sally and I Call Your Name, were also included. More than 1,000 fans were waiting for the Beatles at Hong Kong's Kai Tak Airport when they arrived on the 8th of June. They were allowed to bypass customs and immigration procedures and were swiftly taken to the President Hotel in Kowloon, where they were booked to stay on the 15th floor. Then, on June 11th, the Beatles flew from Hong Kong to Sydney, stopping en route in Darwin to allow their airplane to refuel. Although it was an unscheduled stop, 400 fans were waiting as they landed in Darwin at 2:35 a.m. July 4th saw the world premiere of A Hard Day's Night. The premiere was attended by the Beatles and their wives and girlfriends, and a host of important guests, including Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon. Nearby, Piccadilly Circus was closed to traffic, as 12,000 fans jostled for a glimpse of the group.
Piccadilly Circus, the heart of London.
Yes.
Here we have the London Pavilion, which is now a shopping arcade, but I believe in the 60s it was a cinema.
That's right, and in fact it was the place where the Beatles had the premieres of their films A Hard Day's Night, Help, and in 1968, Yellow Submarine. And all of them were Royal World charity gala premieres. That was the status of the Beatles in the 60s. And on all 3 occasions for their premieres, the traffic in Piccadilly Circus was brought to an absolute standstill. Thousands of people mobbing the streets. And, you know, just amazing occasions every time. And it showed their pulling power, even through to the end of the decade, that they could mob the streets like that just by turning up together.
I was doing a show in London called Oh Lovely War, musical, at Wyndham's Theatre. And they came to see it, and John particularly saw the show and he said, "Hey Vic, you got to be in our film." And that was it, and I met the producer and the director, and I was in Hard Day's Night. And of course I was a fan, you see, and suddenly when they turned up, and I loved the music, And suddenly when they turned up, it was absolutely sensational. When I first walked on the set, I was playing a television director in Hard Day's Night. And as I walked on the set before we started shooting, we started to talk. And it was as if we'd known each other all our lives. It was the most extraordinary thing. I think it's because they came from Liverpool, and I came from South Wales, that those kind of backgrounds, that we sort of hit it off straight away, and we just started talking, and, well, we hadn't really stopped.
How did it compare when you met them there, as they were as people, to what their public image was, and were you surprised? Or?
Well, the most extraordinary thing about them was they were really, truly extraordinary because they were really, truly ordinary. Now, what I mean by that is, to be truly ordinary is marvellous. They were truly ordinary because they had no hang-ups. They didn't have any attitudes. They didn't have any chips on their shoulders. They were just there. And in the middle of what you could call a kind of, well, in the hurricane of Beatlemania, there was a still, small centre. In the middle of it, these four lads sat talking, and they used to say to me, "What did you talk about on the set of those films?" And I said, "Well, we'd be sitting behind this bit of white stuff out there on Hard Day's Night particularly. There'd be all these fans screaming, and we'd be sitting in there talking, and we talk about the Freudian interpretation of dreams as opposed to the Jungian interpretation of dreams. They were talking about what dreams meant, or they'd say things like, John would say, "I wonder, did Beethoven ever write any music for himself rather than for his patron?" They used to talk about things like, well, have laughs as well and jokes, but really straight into fascinating conversations. And when I used to say to people, they used to say the Beatles talked about Freud, because you see, at that time, you must remember that the world's changed a lot then. Pop stars, so-called, or the Fab Four, so-called, people outside thought they were dim-witted idiots, not anything but. And when they wanted to discover something, John was very hungry about reading about things. Let's go somewhere, let's go to the theatre, let's go. They wanted to know about things. There were people who were really hungry for information.
What kind of things was he reading around that time?
Well, John at that time, particularly, he was actually reading the Jungian interpretation of dreams, as opposed to what Freud said. It was, I mean, it sounds heavy, but it really wasn't. It was great fun. And he'd love to talk about things like, well, if you like, cybernetics. He was talking about computers and what they would do, what they think they could do. I mean, then, when it had just started, it was really great conversation, great fun. And also, I mean, there'd be all sorts of jokes inside. I remember I was in a car with them once, and it was jammed. You couldn't get out of the car. The fans were all around it. They were pushing and screaming against the car, and we didn't know what to do. We were sitting in it. And John just turned around and said, "Push Paul out first, he's the prettiest." I mean, the laughs they had in the middle of it. But you see, because they were a still small centre, and there were four ordinary lads, and by that I mean truly extraordinary, by being really basic, that they kept themselves sane.
This was followed on July 10th with both the Hard Day's Night single and album. It entered the UK charts on the 18th of July, and a week later knocked the Rolling Stones' It's All Over Now from the #1 spot. It remained there for 3 weeks and spent a further 9 weeks in the charts. The A Hard Day's Night album had advance orders of over 250,000. It hit #1 on the 25th of July 1964, where it remained for an astonishing 21 consecutive weeks. In all, it spent 38 weeks in the UK charts, and by the end of 1964, it had sold more than 600,000 copies.
Behind me is Coco, the new trendy name for what used to be the Camden Palace, which in the 70s was one of London's greatest and most well-known rock venues. In the 60s, in fact from 1957 onwards, it was actually a BBC live soundstage, which means everybody that did a BBC session or recording from the Goons onwards would have used that stage in there. And that includes the Beatles. Yeah, the Beatles, the Fab Four, would have been inside what is now Coco. Take a look at that building. Behind me is Palladium House. It's just lower down in the Palladium, just off Oxford Street in central London. It was from 1965 Brian Epstein's management office. Had Brian lived, he was going to go into business partnership with Robert Stigwood. Imagine what a team that would have created. The Beatles and the Bee Gees all on one management roster. Doesn't sound too bad to me. They were, had Brian lived, also going to manage a young black artist. He was known as Jimi Hendrix. Who knows what would have happened? Palladium House was Brian Epstein's office. It's right here in central London. Behind me is the Bag o' Nails pub. In fact, just round the corner in that direction is Buckingham Palace, which is kind of fitting because in the 1960s the London press dubbed this pub the Bag o' Nails Buckingham Palace Mark II. You want to know why? Dead simple. The upstairs room was the drinking place of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, and just about every major 60s band that ever passed through central London. That was where they did all the drinking. That was nicknamed Buckingham Palace Mark II, and that is the Bag of Nails. Carnaby Street's in London. It was once said that if aliens came back and visited right now, they'd wonder where the hell they'd arrived at. In the 60s and the 70s, it was the coolest place in the world. If you wanted that t-shirt you'd spent all your life looking for, it was here. If you wanted that jacket that looked like you just stepped off the cover of Sgt. Pepper, you came down to Carnaby Street. The mod capital of the world in the 1960s. The Rolling Stones, the Beach Boys when they were here in 1967, Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, they all shopped here, they all bought their clothing here. John Lennon once said if you couldn't find one on Carnaby Street, there's a possibility that one had never been made. This is Carnaby Street. It's still mod today, it's really hip.
In August, the Beatles continued to tour America, finishing off the Paramount Theater in New York on Sunday, September 20th. October sees the Beatles recording more tracks, 8 days a week, Kansas City / Hey 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 Hey, Mr. Moonlight, I Feel Fine, I'll Follow the Sun, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, Rock and Roll Music, and Words of Love. November 30th, Brian Epstein appears on the long-running BBC radio series Desert Island Discs. His choice of music was George Martin Orchestra, All My Loving, Johann Sebastian Bach, Brandenburg Concerto No. 5 in D major, Quartet Tres Bien, Kilimanjaro, The Beatles, She's a Woman, Jean Sibelius, Symphony No. 2 in D major, Michael Olatunji, Odundi Odundi, Happy New Year, Max Bruch, Violin Concerto No. 1 in D minor, Carmen Amaya and Company, Fiesta de Juarez. December 1st, Ringo Starr begins a 10-day stay at University College Hospital in London. He was booked in to have his tonsils removed, an operation that took place the following day. December 4th saw the release of the Beatles' fourth Parlophone / EMI album, Beatles for Sale, which contains a mix of Lennon, McCartney originals and cover versions. Because their schedules were so busy by the later half of 1964, the Beatles resorted to recording several Cavern Club-era songs. I'll Follow the Sun was written by Paul McCartney in 1959 and dusted down when it looked like they may be lacking suitable material. December 15th saw the release of Beatles 65, the Beatles' fifth album on Capitol Records, included the majority of songs from Beatles for Sale, and added I'll Be Back, She's a Woman, and I Feel Fine. Of the Beatles for Sale songs, it left out 8 Days a Week, Words of Love, Every Little Thing, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, What You're Doing, and Kansas City / Hey 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 Hey. Those songs were included on the June 1965 album Beatles 6. December 24th, the Beatles start another Beatles Christmas show. Following the success of the Beatles Christmas show in December 1963 and early 1964, Brian Epstein decided that the group should repeat the trick, this time at the Hammersmith Odeon in London. The formula was much the same as the previous years, with music, pantomime sketches, comedy, and several special guests. These included Freddie and the Dreamers, Sounds Incorporated, Elkie Brooks, the Yardbirds, Michael Haslam, the Mike Cotton Sound, and Ray Fell. The compeer was Jimmy Savile.
So Richard, this is the London Apollo, but it didn't always look like this, did it?
No, back in 1964, Christmas of 1964, you would have seen the letters The Beatles Christmas Show right across the front. It was a package show that they did for their fans, comedy and music. And in those days, this was, of course, the Hammersmith Odeon. And then in Christmas of 65, they did another Beatles Christmas show. Didn't repeat it in 66.
Bottle or two, a couple of bottles, packets of ciggies.
How about a special message from George?
Yeah, a very, very happy Christmas and send me jacket back. It's cold.
John.
Gary Crimble and Manny Rudolph.
Ringo.
Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, see you soon.
Paul.
Lots of luck and many presents and happy Crimble. That's all I think.
A little song for Christmas.
Okay.
Gary Crimble to you, Gary Crimble to you, Gary Crimble, dear Rudolph, Gary Crimble, me too. Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer had a very shiny nose, and when he shined down it, all right.
Happy Christmas, all the best.
Thank you.
But the main reason that we're here really is not so much for what they did during the Christmas shows, but for an interesting little artifact around the back of the building.
So Richard, this wrought iron staircase behind the theatre looms large in the Beatles legend.
Absolutely. 1964, the film A Hard Day's Night, and there's a segment where the Beatles come rushing out of here. Ringo comes out of this door and says, "We're out." They've just escaped the pressures of filming a TV show, and they come running down this wrought iron staircase and to the song Can't Buy Me Love, and it's like in fast motion. You see them all running down this staircase and running out.
I remember, and they rush off into this field here.
There is no field here. There never was. It's just a parking lot, but basically it was spliced together in the film almost seamlessly.
February 1st, 1965, Capitol Records released their second and final Beatles EP, 4x4 The Beatles. The EP contained 4 songs, all from the albums Beatles for Sale and Beatles 65, Honey Don't, I'm a Loser, Mr. Moonlight, and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. February 23rd, the Beatles began filming their second feature film, Help. March 22nd saw the release of the early Beatles album. Capitol Records were still keen to wring as much money as possible out of Beatles fans in America, leading to the release of the early Beatles in 1965 of March. It contained 11 songs from Please Please Me. I Saw Her Standing There, Misery, and There's a Place were omitted. The 11th of May in 1965 was the group's final day of work on the film Help. The shooting had begun in the Bahamas on the 23rd of February in 1965, and the group totaled 54 days of work until this day. Several scenes in London were also filmed by director Richard Lester on the following day, May the 12th, but these did not feature the Beatles. The Beatles' U.S. label, Capitol Records, released the album Beatles 6 on the 14th of June in 1965. It was the group's 6th LP release by the label, not counting the Beatles' story documentary. Vijay and United Artists Records had each released an album too, meaning that Beatles 6 was the group's 9th album to be released stateside. As with all their releases up to 1966, the Beatles had little say in the contents of the album. It did, however, contain 2 songs recorded especially for North American listeners, covers of Larry Williams' Bad Boy and Dizzy Miss Lizzie, both of which were taped at Abbey Road on the 10th of May in 1965.
let's meet the Beatles. I've got Paul and John.
John.
And Paul's talking to George and Ringo. Well, I said in my intro, and you were listening to it, that there have been a lot of changes since this time last year. Well, we've seen them, you know, we've seen you making films and doing all sorts of marvellous things, but what have the changes meant to you?
Nothing really. I think the main changes are in people's attitudes to you.
How?
I don't know. But it's people who change rather than you. You know, we feel exactly the same, really. Got a new suit, though.
But you've made a film since then, and you just finished it.
Yeah.
Why did you make a film?
Well, it's a logical step, isn't it? And I believe it's quite lucrative. I believe.
Anyway, someone asked us.
Yeah, we were asked to do it. We said yeah, and Alan Owen wrote it, and we changed it, and we're all.
It's called A Hard Day's Night.
Hard
At
Day's
your local
Night.
cinema now.
Not now.
Not now. Soon.
What difference is there since last June up to now? What sort of things have happened to you since then?
The main difference is that we've got more money and less time to ourselves. You know, everything's speeded up and we're just running around like mad.
If you ever manage to get away from the crowds, what sort of things do you like to do?
Sleep, see films, go to nightclubs, drive my car, and that's it.
Do you find any difficulty in keeping up your public image? Just
No.
What image?
It's our image is just us. You know, as we were. We didn't try and make an image. It just happened, and so we don't have to keep it up. We just remain ourselves. Don't we, Ringo?
Well, we do. I mean,
Don't
the
know
other
about
two
that.
were worried about.
October 26th, the Beatles collect their MBEs from the Queen at Buckingham Palace.
Ringo, how do you feel about going to the palace in a morning suit and all that?
I don't mind, you know. It's all right when I buy one.
You haven't got one?
No, not yet. I've got an evening suit. That'll do.
I don't think it will. It's different from a morning suit.
Well, I'll just go in my pajamas then.
On June 11th, the Beatles were awarded the MBE. The Beatles were nominated for the award by Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who was also a member of Parliament for Huyton, Merseyside. It was widely seen as an attempt by Wilson to appear in touch with the younger generation, although at the time the voting age was 21.
Well, gentlemen, first of all, many congratulations on your MBE. The whole country seems very delighted indeed, but how do you feel about it, Paul?
Delighted indeed. You know, I'm glad everyone's delighted. I love it.
But I mean, is it fun for you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, it'd be fun for you, wouldn't it? You know, we
Yeah,
just
I bet
woke
it
up
would.
one morning and he said, "Number." You know, it's great.
Ringo, how did you first hear about it?
Well, we heard about it 6 weeks ago when we got the forms to fill in, and then we knew that we were going to get it 2 days ago, officially.
How did these forms come? What, straight through the post or in the fan mail or what?
I don't, just in brown envelopes. They were delivered by somebody, you know, by hand. I think one of Brian's secretaries.
I'll tell you.
All right,
I'll
then, well,
tell
how did it happen?
They were sent from the Prime Minister of Downing Street to our manager's office, and they were delivered from there to Twickenham, where we were filming. And then about the day later, we just found them, and we thought we were being called up to the army. And then we opened them, and we found out we weren't. We
all said that line.
I know, but this is at ITV. The other, that was the other one.
July 19th, the Beatles released the title song to their second feature film, Help. The Beatles' second film, Help, had its royal premiere at the London Pavilion, Piccadilly Circus, London. 10,000 fans gathered outside to see the group arrive in a black Rolls-Royce. Inside the pavilion, they met Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon, who had delayed their summer holiday for the event. August 6th saw the release of the Beatles' fifth UK album, Help. Saturday, August 14th, the Beatles had wowed U.S. television audiences during their first 3 appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, recorded in February 1964 during their first American visit. On this day, they made a 4th and final appearance. August 27, the meeting of 2 great musical acts of the 20th century took place, the Beatles and Elvis Presley. The meeting took place at Presley's mansion at 565 Perugia Way, Bel Air, Los Angeles. The Beatles arrived at 11 p.m. and were greeted by Elvis in his large circular living room. The room was bathed in red and blue light and contained a color television, jukebox, crescent-shaped couch, games tables, and a bar. September 25th saw the start of the Beatles cartoon series. It ran until 1969 on the ABC network, with 39 episodes produced over 3 seasons. The Beatles' 6th UK album, Rubber Soul, was released on December 3rd. It had advance orders of more than 500,000 and entered the album charts on December 11th, 1965, and spent 9 weeks at the top from the 25th of December. It remained in the charts for 42 consecutive weeks. With a new year came new experiences for the Beatles. On the 5th of January in 1966, following their record-breaking concert at New York's Shea Stadium on the 15th of August in 1965, it was decided that extra recordings would be needed if the footage was to be released to the public. The concert performance suffered as the Beatles couldn't hear themselves against the screams of 55,600 fans, and the mobile recording facilities had left the sound quality of the recordings below standard. The film of the Beatles' 15th August 1965 concert at New York's Shea Stadium had its world premiere on BBC One in the UK on March 1st. There were more problems for the Beatles in the London Standard newspaper that March. John Lennon states, "We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." This statement was republished around the world.
Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right and I'll be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. John Lennon quoted in the London Evening Standard, March the 4th. Words which roused the Protestant fury of the American South as the Beatles began their tour of the States. In Chicago, Lennon apologized.
Well, originally I was pointed out that fact in reference to England, that we meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it for the fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here. No, I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
Well, hi, everybody. This is Tommy Charles on the air here at WAQY Radio in Birmingham, Alabama. We've got music for you on a beautiful Thursday afternoon.
This is where the trouble all began, here in the tiny top-floor studio of station WAQY, wacky radio to the 750,000 citizens of Birmingham, Alabama. Disc jockey and station manager Tommy Charles read in Datebook magazine John Lennon's reported remarks on Christianity, remarks that had gone almost unnoticed in the 5 months since they were first published in Britain. Charging that Lennon's remarks were absurd and sacrilegious, Charles banned Beatles records from his programs and decided to build a mammoth bonfire to consume the group's records and souvenirs. Tommy, why this violent reaction to what John Lennon said?
Well, I wouldn't call exactly what I have done a violent reaction. However, the Beatles for a long time have been able to, because of their tremendous popularity throughout the world, especially with the younger set, have been able to say whatever they wanted to without any regard for judgment or maturity or the wisdom of it. And no one yet has challenged them to any tremendous degree where it might count or where they might feel it.
What difference has all this row made to this tour, do you think? Any at all? Paul?
I don't think it's made much difference. It's made it more hectic. It's made all the press conferences mean a bit more. People said to us, you know, last time we came, all our answers were a bit flippant. And I said, why isn't it this time? Well, the thing is, the questions are a bit more serious this time. It hasn't affected any of the bookings. The bookings have been, the people coming to the concerts have been the same, except for the first show in Memphis, which was a bit down, you know, but so what?
The disc jockey, Tommy Charles, who started this row off, has said that he won't play your records until you've grown up a little. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't mind if he never plays them again.
You see, this is the thing, you know, everyone seems to think when they hear us say things like this, that we're so childish, you know. I mean, you can't say things like that unless you're a silly little child. But
and if he was grown up, he wouldn't have done the thing, because he only did it for a stunt anyway. So, I mean, who's he to say about growing up? Who is he?
Who is this guy?
Who is he?
Just who?
Apart from that, it's great.
Having a swinging tour?
Do you feel that Americans are out to get you, that this is all developing into something of a witch hunt?
No, we thought it might be that kind of thing. I think a lot of people in England did, because there's this thing about, you know, when America gets violent, gets very hung up on a thing, it tends to have this sort of Ku Klux Klan thing around it.
It seems to me you've always been successful because you've been outspoken and direct and forthright and all this sort of thing. Does it seem a bit hard to you that people are now knocking you for this very thing?
Yes, Richard.
It seems very hard.
It seems hard, you know, free speech.
But is it possible just to say what you think all the time? What about 14-year-old teenagers who think you're absolutely marvellous and can't bear to be heard?
You see, we're not, when we say anything like that, we don't say it as older people seem to think, to be offensive. We mean it helpfully, you know, and if it's wrong, what we say, okay, it's wrong, and people can say, you know, you're wrong about that one. But in many cases, we believe it's right, you know, we're quite serious about it.
But do you mind being asked questions, for example, in America, people keep asking you questions about Vietnam. Does this seem useful?
Well, I don't know, you know, if you can say that war's no good and a few people believe you, then it may be good, I don't know. You can't say it too much, though, that's the trouble.
It seems a bit silly to be in America and for none of them to mention Vietnam as if nothing was happening.
But why should they ask you about it? You're successful entertainer.
That is the thing. You know.
Because Americans always ask showbiz people what they think about it. So do the British, you know. Showbiz, you know how it is. But I mean, you've just got to, you can't just keep quiet about anything that's going on in the world unless you're a monk. Sorry, monks, I didn't mean it. I meant actually.
In April, the Beatles spent most of the month recording. By May, they were busy making Yellow Submarine. On the 30th of June, the Beatles were in Japan touring. Later, going on to the Philippines on July 4th. The release of the album Revolver came August 4th, alongside the single Eleanor Rigby from the film Yellow Submarine. The Beatles' second double A-side entered the UK singles charts on the 11th of August, 1966, and 7 days later it hit the #1 spot. On August 29th at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, the Beatles performed their last ever concert. The group knew it was to be their final show. Recognizing its significance, John Lennon and Paul McCartney took a camera onto the stage, with which they took pictures of the crowd, the rest of the group, and themselves at arm's length. September 19th, John Lennon starts filming How I Won the War for Richard Lester.
It's only funny if he doesn't eat pie. But I don't see any reason why you can't even pull up the dialogue over the plane shot.
I mean, you could not have that shot at all.
I like it. Now, John on his own, playing the part of someone else, someone who is similar in character to himself, someone who he understands, but in fact a fictional part, a man who has nothing to do with the 60s, a man who was 20 years old in 1940, with none of the pop elements, none of the fans, none of the persona of a 1966 man. I think that's a good step forward, because he can then, if that works, and I'm not one to predict, it's for the audience to say whether they consider that successful. It's a fairly reasonable transition for all of them to play the parts of other people.
You've been working with them over the past 2 or 3 years. Now the stimulus of the great pop explosion has gone. Is there a certain sense of sort of dying away of enthusiasm and sort of running down of the group?
Of a dying away of their own enthusiasm?
Yes.
I don't think so. I think their enthusiasms are now being channeled into other areas, like composing for films, like writing, like appearing from time to time as actors, like searching for what they want to do. McCartney himself, I think, said he'd hate to be a 30-year-old Beatle, which gives him 4 or 5 years now. Last in terms of people who come together and make records over the next few years, I think certainly as people who come together perhaps once a year and make a film. And that's possible.
On the 7th of November, he meets Yoko Ono for the first time, while Paul McCartney has the idea for Sgt. Pepper on November 19th. On December 9th, the release of a collection of oldies album. It contained 8 tracks that had previously appeared on UK albums, and a further 8 singles tracks which were issued on LP. Just one song, Bad Boy, was previously unreleased. This made the album an essential purchase for 1966 Beatles completists, although it was less value for money for other fans. January 1967 saw various projects come and go. A new script by Joe Orton was rejected. The recording of Strawberry Fields, When I'm 64, Penny Lane, and Carnival of Light. In February, they started recording Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. By March, they went on to A Day in the Life, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Lovely Rita, Getting Better, She's Leaving Home, With a Little Help from My Friends, and Being the Benefit of Mr. Kite. April 19th, the Beatles and Company are formed. This company would later be Apple.
It's a business concerning records, films, and electronics. And as a sideline, whatever it's called, manufacturing, whatever. But we want to set up a system whereby people who just want to make a film about anything don't have to go on their knees in somebody's office, probably yours.
By April 25th, the Beatles are recording Magical Mystery Tour, which continues through to May. On June 1st, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album is released. Sgt. Pepper entered the UK charts on the 3rd of June in 1967. The following week, it was at number 1, where it remained for 23 weeks. It returned to the top spot for another week on the 25th of November, for 2 weeks from the 23rd of December, and for a final week on the 3rd of February in 1968. In all, it spent 148 consecutive weeks in the charts. Sgt. Pepper sold more than 250,000 copies in the UK in its first week of release, and by the end of June had sold over 500,000. It remains in the top 10 best-selling albums of all time, both in the UK and worldwide.
Day in the Life was just, I mean, the musicians were just told, you know, you start on this note here and just play anything you want. That was sort of like foreign to them. I mean, that and All You Need Is Love stick in my mind as, you know, the two of the most amazing days at Abbey Road, you know. I mean, All You Need Is Love had so much pressure on all of us for getting through this song without a problem, you know, because there was however many million people watching, you know.
Yeah, I might get this the wrong way round, but what happened, we'd recorded Strawberry Fields, and John was sort of happy with it, but we could tell by his face he wasn't really happy with it. So about two weeks later, he came and said, you know, I want to re-record Strawberry Fields again. And he said, I want it more aggressive and like aggressive, you know, orchestral instruments at the end and stuff. So we re-recorded it. And then I think it was the day after we'd finished it, he came in and said, you know, I really liked the first half of the first version we did and the second half of the new version. And the problem was they were 2 different tempos and they were different keys. So George and I put our heads together on this and thought, well, what we had to, so we mixed both versions and we had a third machine to record what we were going to do onto this third quarter-inch machine. So on the first machine, I had to gradually speed up, I might have got this the wrong way around, gradually speed up the first half to marry the tempo and the key of where it enters the second half. And I think I had that on the second one on very speed. And then where the edit point was going to be, I then gradually sped up or slowed down the second version. So the only way I could do it was to do, as I said before, we didn't use razor blades for editing there, and we had little brass scissors. So I did a little, instead of a 45-degree cut, I couldn't do that because I knew it would jump. So I sort of snipped a long sort of crossfade cut on the quarter-inch. And that's what I did, and it actually worked. But I mean, I'm making it sound a lot sort of simpler than it really was. But I mean, today you could just press a couple of buttons and you've done it, and which is But I guess in a sense this has been like a pioneer, I suppose. We were virtually doing the impossible, because it wasn't. No one else would have. They just would have poo-pooed it off. I mean, in the Beatles' vocabulary, there was no words such as no, you can't, or the word no. There was always a way round of finding an answer to their questions, or which was good for us, because we tried to give them answers to whatever they wanted to do.
It was a team. I mean, it was a team of people. Jeff and I had a great relationship, and we liked to have a laugh. And Jeff would do something and he'd look across to me, and if I was laughing or I was sort of putting my thumb up, or I'd be flanging something and it would work really well, and they wouldn't necessarily notice what was going on, and George Martin wouldn't necessarily say anything, or he'd say, oh honestly, Richard, that's too much, and Jeff would go, yeah, it's great, and then it would be a combination of John and Jeff and I saying great, and then, well, sorry, we've won that battle, So it was a kind of a team thing, which is why I insist that everybody buys the mono pepper, not the stereo version, because the mono is the one where we were all there.
Of their material really wasn't like, Paul was like always to me the romantic, and John was the aggressive one, and it was the combination of the two people that made these great sort of records. It was because all they really came into the studio with was a lyric. There was no like real demos, and they had an idea of how they would do it, with what instrumentation they'd do the song with. So we might spend 4 or 5 hours with guitar, piano, or electric guitar, piano, and something else, and Ringo doing some sort of rhythm pattern. And we might spend 4 or 5 hours doing that and realizing it was probably getting nowhere, and realizing that instrumentation was the wrong instrumentation for the song. So that would get changed maybe into acoustic guitars and harpsichord or organ and rhythm, and Ringo would change his rhythm pattern. And then that would be the accepted way of the way the song was to be done. And often when you're doing that, mistakes happen, and in the arrangement, and sometimes those mistakes are really good, so we used to embellish those mistakes. So that's how some of those really, I call them really great arrangements happen, by mistakes happening on the run-throughs of the construction of the songs. So that's how basically all those songs were made, and I had the luxury of time, because it was taking time for the routining of those songs, being limited on the equipment we had, and it was also really hard to get, for instance, if there were 2 electric guitars involved, and we're listening to one loudspeaker for mono, to get each guitar to go in its own place and its own plane with its own proper equalization and reverbs. Although we didn't use a lot of reverbs or echoes, but I never really used to, because I'm just listening to sounds and tonalities when I'm constructing these mixings of the songs, and often I'd realise that maybe John's guitar sounded fine, but George's wasn't quite making it, or vice versa. And I'd try and do what I could with the amplifier because of my equalization limitations, and then realise even that wouldn't work. So I used to just say to George or John, can you just use another guitar that's a bit brighter? I was never aware sometimes of what guitars they were even playing, because I was just listening, So that's what used to happen on the guitar side, and sometimes it would take like 2 hours. And as I said, I had the luxury of time to actually get those 2 guitars to come out note for note in their own place from one loudspeaker. So it was really hard, but rewarding at the same time, and that's how all that stuff was constructed. There's no real sounds that clutter or cover other sounds. But that, as I said, that was having the luxury of time.
You know, and speaking of the luxury of time, you know, what's getting me as being a fan, and the idea that, so they had stopped touring so that they could spend more time in the studio, and because they were the biggest band in the world. I guess the other person that I remember hearing that is Brian Wilson got to spend a lot of time in the studio, and I know they were very influenced by Pet Sounds and everything. So that's another point where I think the history of recording changed, because you got to spend all this time, and you were trying to make them happy, which was probably impossible. But and like you said, they wouldn't take no for an answer on anything, and you create. And when you listen, the idea of Revolver, of course, was amazing. Then Sgt. Pepper, the fact that was 4+4, you're bouncing between 4 tracks, and you're having to commit the EQ and reverb and all that as you're putting down, and it's an amazing accomplishment. I think everyone here would acknowledge who are recording engineers who have a much easier way of accomplishing all that today.
I mean, it was great fun, and as I said, extremely rewarding once you'd actually capture that. And we knew that when we were, I think on Mr. Kite on Pepper, we did 4-track to 4-track to 4-track. But a lot of the sound effects across the benefit of Mr. Kite are being sent from stereo machines, because we didn't have any more tracks on the 4 tracks, because the master's still going to end up on 1 4-track to lay stuff on.
Now, speaking for the benefit of Mr. Kite, for those who have not heard this story, could you explain sort of the organ calliope sounds and how you accomplished that?
Well, but yeah, basically there was like some backwards glockenspiels recorded and sped up, and also EMI had an extensive sound effects library with like brass bands and steam organs and all sorts of stuff that a guy called Stuart Eltham used to collect. He was like the sound effects man, plus one of the finest recording engineers as well at EMI at that time. He used to do a lot of classical recordings and middle of the road recordings. He taught me a lot as well. But Stuart was like the curator of all the sound effects. So we went up into the sound effects library and copied the sound effects that we thought we'd need and chopped them all up into little bits and threw them up in the air, and they all landed on the floor, and then we stuck them all back together again. And that was that. If that answers your question. I think we did a similar thing for Yellow Submarine as well. And I know on one occasion, I think it may have been Yellow Submarine on the brass band thing, we threw them all up in the air and I stuck them all back together, and I stuck them all back together in the right order.
No, it's all amazing. I mean, like now there's different ways of accomplishing that, but you were really kind of sort of making this up on the fly.
Yeah, and getting back to Mr. Kite again, the way, you know, John could only express himself in a certain way. And he actually, his direction on Mr. Kite was he wanted to smell the sawdust on the floor. And that's how he interpreted the way he wanted to hear that, by smelling the sawdust. Yeah.
Now, we could spend like an hour just talking about Pepper, but I've got to ask you about A Day in the Life, which is at the time, you know, hearing this as a kid, and the things that had come before, you know, so Revolver gives you a little bit of prep for what's coming, but it was beyond mind-blowing to hear Sgt. Pepper at that point in time, and but A Day in the Life, wow, so could you kind of take us through how you accomplished that?
Yeah, so I mean, going back to that, it was like one of the biggest moments of my life, because, you know, from the very outset of the song, when John just ran through it in the studio, and I was down in the studio, and, you know, you could just feel the magic in the vocal on that. And of course, John, as I said, did not like the sound of his voice. He always wanted something added to it, which was the repeat echo. So it was actually recorded with that repeat echo. So anyway, you know, we went back up into the control room, and we were about to start recording the song in its basic form. And like shivers ran down your back from that vocal performance, you know. So there were gaps left in the song. No one knew what was going to go into the gaps. And I wanted to get on those drum breaks in the song. I wanted to get like a drum sound of drums that no one had ever heard before. So what I did, I took, again being naive, I guess in a sense, took the bottom skins off the tom-toms and put some D19s in glass jugs with towels wrapped around them underneath the toms. theory being that the attack comes from the top and the tonality comes from the bottom. So that's how I recorded the drums, and no one, I mean, you have to go back to those days. No one had ever heard drums sound like that, and it was just amazing. So when it came to do the orchestral part, I think it was, someone said to George Martin, well, you know, we need a 90-piece orchestra to go in those gaps. And then George said, well, EMI won't pay for that because EMI is still paying for the sessions. So then Ringo said, well, let's get a 45-piece orchestra and put it on twice. So anyway, and the direction to the orchestra was, which took a long time to get through to them because they were classical musicians, was the score, I think, was like 24 bars, and you start on this note, and you end up after the 24th bar on this note, but you do it in your own time, not listening to the musician next to you. And because they said, well, we can't do that. And I guess musicians then had to have the notes written. I mean, there was no way they were going to improvise themselves. So anyway, it was like a 20-minute discussion from George Martin to the orchestra, and they're still saying, no, we can't do it. And George is saying, well, just don't listen to the person next to you, just in your own time, go from that note to that note. Someone's going to count the bars for you. You just reach that note whenever you want to, over 24 bars. So then, plus the fact that that night they were asked to wear tuxedos and all these funny noses and funny glasses and all these novelty things and stuff. So that added to the tension. Then Paul had a discussion with them about, no, come on, you can do it, you know. And this is like 35 minutes after they were supposed to be doing this. Luckily there was David Mason, who'd played the piccolo trumpet on Penny Lane, and Alan Civil, who'd done the French horn on For No One, who were principal brass players within, I think it was the Philharmonic or the Philharmonia Orchestra at that time. And he said, no, come on, lads, we can do this, because, you know, they played on a couple of the singles, and what was actually what was happening in front of our eyes now was the fact this barrier between the classical people and the pop people was gradually being broken down slightly, and it was. From that night, it was broken down. So anyway, we did start to do the recording, and they did eventually do the one note to the second note in the 24 bars with Mal Evans counting, with the alarm clock going off to alert them that the 23rd bar was coming up, so the 24th bar was the next bar. So what we actually did on that as well, for the first time we tried to lock two 4-track machines together. And the way we did that was to actually pulse both motors with a 50-cycle pulse. But there was no sort of lockable way of doing it, so we had to put a grease mark on because we laid down the first orchestral recording on track 4 of the master 4-track. So then we put a grease pencil mark on both machines, put this one into play and this one into record, and did another pass on the orchestra, and then we did another 3 passes on the orchestra without them knowing. Eventually they did know that we'd actually recorded them 5 times, and they actually did get paid for that. But that night they did not know what we'd done. Where the piano chord comes in on the end, that came about 2 weeks later when Paul had an idea the night we'd done the orchestra to put this sort of sort of sound, which would have been where the piano is, and it didn't work because there was a lot of invited guests like the Rolling Stones, and some of the Monkees were there, I believe, and a few other people to add to the festivities while all this orchestral thing's going on. There is a 16mm film that flies around on YouTube, I think, sometimes of the session. So anyway, Richard and myself that night, we set up a monitor mix, and the control room, it was done in number 1 Abbey Road, and the control room was quite small, and a couple of the Rolling Stones were in the back of the control room, and Ron Richards, who was the producer of the Hollies, was sitting on the floor by the mixing console. And so Richard and I played it back, and it was like the most amazing thing you've ever heard in your life, and there was absolute silence at the end of the playback. And Ron had his head in his hands, and he said, I'm going to give the business up. You know, and this is the guy that produces the Hollies, and he was really serious. And if you'd have been there that night, you would have realized what we'd actually listened to. And it was like going from a square black and white picture to CinemaScope Technicolor. It was just amazing. It really was.
With seemingly unstoppable momentum during the summer of 1967, On the 18th of May, the Beatles sign a contract to represent the BBC and Britain on Our World, the world's first live television satellite link-up to be seen by approximately 400 million people across 5 continents. The Beatles' appearance was announced 4 days later, on May the 22nd. John Lennon wrote the song All You Need Is Love, especially for the occasion, to the brief given by the BBC. It had to be simple so that viewers around the world would understand it. Our World took place on the 25th of June in 1967. Between the announcement and the broadcast date, the Beatles recorded the rhythm track and some basic vocals. Over the next few months, the Beatles kept busy, recording and traveling. But late on Sunday, the 27th of August in 1967, sudden news rocked the Beatles' world. Their manager, Brian Epstein, was found dead at his home in Chapel Street, London. The Beatles were in Bangor in North Wales when word came through that their manager, Brian Epstein, had died.
John, where would you be today without Mr. Epstein?
I don't know.
Are you driving down to London tonight?
Yes, somebody's taking us down here.
You heard the news this afternoon, I believe.
Yes.
And Paul's already gone down?
Yes.
I see. You've no idea what your plans are for tomorrow?
No, we'd just go and find out, you know. And
just have to play everything by ear.
Yes. I understand that Mr. Epstein was to be initiated here tomorrow.
Yes.
When was he coming up? Was he coming up in the afternoon?
Tomorrow, just Monday, that's all we knew.
Had you told him very much about the spiritual regeneration movement?
Well, as much as we'd learned about spiritualism and various things of that nature, then we'd tried to pass on to him, and he was equally as interested as we are, as everybody should be. He wanted to know about life as much as we do.
Had you spoken to him since since you became interested this weekend?
No.
I spoke to him Wednesday evening, the evening before we first saw Maharishi's lecture, and he was in great spirits.
And when did he tell you that he'd like to be initiated?
Well, when we arrived here on, I think Friday, we got a telephone call later that day to say that Brian would follow us up and be here Monday.
Do you intend returning to Bangor before the end of this conference?
We probably won't have time now, because Maharishi will only be here till about Thursday, and we'll have so much to do in London that we'll have to meet him again some other time.
I understand that this afternoon Maharishi conferred with you all. Could I ask you what advice he offered you?
He told us to, not to get overwhelmed by grief, and to whatever thoughts we have of Brian, to keep them happy, because any thoughts we have of him will travel to him wherever he is.
Had he ever met Mr. Epstein?
No, but he was looking forward to meeting him.
4 days later, after the death of Epstein, the Beatles issued a statement about the future of their management company, NEMS Enterprises. The group revealed that they would continue to be managed by NEMS until further notice, but that Clive Epstein, Brian's brother, would not be their personal manager. No one could replace Brian, Paul McCartney was quoted as saying. The filming of the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour started Monday, September 11th. It was mostly done in 2 weeks. The story was basic and traditional for pop package tours, involving several bands, to begin at London's Allsop Place, near to Baker Street Underground Station. Paul McCartney decided that the mystery trip should start at the same location at 10:45 a.m. The coach, however, was still being decorated with the Magical Mystery Tour lettering and colors. The passengers included family, friends, fan club staff, actors, and other selected travelers who were made to wait 2 hours for its arrival. In October, the Beatles continued to film Magical Mystery Tour, plus attend the premiere of John Lennon's film, How I Won the War. November was filled with more recording time. On December 1st, the Beatles launched the Apple Boutique at 94 Baker Street in London, which later closed on the 31st of July in 1968. More than 2 weeks before its accompanying film received its premiere on BBC television, the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour EP was released. The package came with a gatefold sleeve and a 28-page book, including lyrics. This retailed at twice the normal price of a single. Having been edited to 55 minutes from nearly 10 hours of footage, the Beatles' television film Magical Mystery Tour had its world premiere on BBC One at 8:35 on December 26, 1967. The film was generally perceived to be the Beatles' first artistic failure. The Magical Mystery Tour film was disliked by critics and viewers alike. In an effort to explain the group's creation, Paul McCartney gave a television interview to David Frost the next day. January 22, 1968, Apple opens offices at 95 Wigmore Street in London. The Beatles opened their offices on the 4th floor of the building and spent a great deal of time in the building during the first part of 1968. Unfortunately for the Beatles, Apple's staff were unable to play records during office hours in case they disturbed the other tenants in the building. This was one of the reasons why they relocated to 3 Savile Row on the 15th of July, although some parts of Apple remained based at Wigmore Street until their lease expired. In February, John Lennon and George Harrison traveled to India. The trip had been due to take place in the summer of 1967, but was postponed following the death of Brian Epstein. The Beatles had chosen instead to press on with the making of Magical Mystery Tour. They were later joined by Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. The Beatles remain in India through March and part of April, except Ringo, who decides to come back to London. In May, John Lennon and Paul McCartney traveled to New York to promote Apple, their new company. On June 18th, the National Theatre's stage version of John Lennon's book, In His Own Right, directed by Victor Spinetti, had its debut at the Old Vic Theatre on London's Waterloo Road. The play was the idea of dramatist Adrian Kennedy, who co-wrote it with Spinetti. They based it on Lennon's first book and the follow-up, A Spaniard in the Works. It featured a character, Me, played by Ronald Pickup, whose thoughts and ideas were followed throughout the play. Lennon's arrival with Yoko Ono caused much fuss amongst journalists and reporters present. Although the pair had first appeared in public some weeks earlier, the news of Lennon's marriage ending was still largely unknown.
Well, an awful lot of the play is about radio and TV.
Well, I mean, that's all I ever heard, didn't I?
Yeah.
I mean, you go home...
Comic books?
Yeah.
The church?
Your comic books.
Your church?
Your classic comics.
Yeah, your classic comics.
Your Beatles.
Your school.
Your school, your pub, and your TV, and your radio.
Exactly.
Well, that's it.
The funny thing, you didn't put in pop music.
No, because up till then, it hadn't hit me.
This is before.
Pop music didn't hit me till I was 16, and this is all before, the things that happened before 16.
But it's not really John's childhood, it's all of ours, really, isn't it, John?
It is, we're all one.
No, but I mean, isn't it?
We're all one, aren't we?
No, but it is, you know.
July 17th was the world premiere of the animated feature film Yellow Submarine. Although the group had largely retreated from the public eye in recent months, with their trip to India and the recording of the White Album, their popularity remained undiminished. As with their previous film openings, large crowds turned out, blocking streets and bringing traffic to a standstill. The same day that the Apple Boutique closed, the Beatles were recording Hey Jude. September 31st, August 22nd. Cynthia Lennon sues John for divorce. John Lennon had previously filed for divorce, alleging that Cynthia had herself been adulterous, a charge she denied. This was the same day as Ringo quits the Beatles. Tensions had been building within the Beatles for some time during the recording of the White Album. On this day, matters came to a head, and Ringo Starr left the group. Hey Jude gets released in the U.S. on August 26th. On September 3rd, Ringo rejoins the group. John and Cynthia's divorce decree would later go through, Friday, November 8th. November would also see the release of the White Album. January 1969, a new year for the Beatles. It saw the recording of the Let It Be sessions. By January 10th, George Harrison had quit the group, only to rejoin on the 15th. Later that month, on January 30th, they do a rooftop concert at the Apple Building. February 3rd, Alan Klein is appointed the Beatles' manager. On March 12th, Paul McCartney marries Linda Eastman at Marylebone Register Office.
When did you decide to get married, Paul?
About a week ago.
What prompted it?
Just, so we decided to do it instead of thinking about it.
Linda, how do you feel about it all? You're obviously terribly happy. How are you feeling this morning?
Terribly happy.
That sounds good enough.
Unquote.
Linda, you've been described as a New York socialite. Does this mean you'll be spending much of your time in New York?
No.
Where will you be living?
In London.
In London. Paul, what about you? How do you feel to be the father
I'll
to
be
a
living in
6-year-old?
London.
You'll be living in London. How about being the father to a 6-year-old child?
It's terrible. It's terrible. I hate it. I hate it, and it's going to be a terrible burden. I do. It's horrible.
Many of the fans, the girls who have been waiting outside the house and outside the hotel today, seem to be more than upset about this. What do you feel?
I don't know what I feel about that, you know.
On this day, the Beatles took part in their penultimate photo session together. It took place in 2 locations, with 3 photographers taking pictures of the group. The first location was at the Mattingly Club on Willoughby Road in East Twickenham in London, followed by more shots taken at number 4 Ducks Walk, where they boarded a boat on the River Thames. The Beatles and the photographers took 3 vehicles to the location: John Lennon's Rolls-Royce, a white Mercedes, and a Humber Snipe. The first photographs were taken with the Beatles leaning against the Rolls-Royce, with the Toms behind them. A crowd soon gathered, and the Beatles obligingly signed autographs. Afterwards, the group moved to the second location, where they were photographed climbing into a rowing boat, the Fritz Otto Maria Anna. They rowed to a small island in the middle of the river, from which they waved to the camera on the riverbank. Nearly a month after its release in the United Kingdom, on May 5th, the Beatles' first single of 1969 was issued in the United States. Get Back with Don't Let Me Down as its B-side. It was credited to the Beatles with Billy Preston. It was the only time such a credit featured on a Beatles release. On June 1st, John Lennon and Yoko Ono record Give Peace a Chance, which will get released on July 4th. On June 4th, the Beatles would release The Ballad of John and Yoko. August 22nd is the Beatles' final photo shoot. September 8th, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison meet to discuss their future. The Beatles had recently finished recording Abbey Road in early September 1969, but they still had much business to deal with. On the 8th of September 1969, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison met at the Apple Corps headquarters at 3 Savile Row, London, to discuss their future. Lennon's assistant, Anthony Fawcett, brought a portable tape recorder to document the meeting, which also allowed the absent Ringo Starr to hear the discussions. At the time, Starr was in the hospital, undergoing tests for an intestinal complaint.
How long do you think you can go on being a practicing Beatle?
It depends how I feel and how they feel, when it happens. I mean, there comes a time when it's time for a Beatle product, and we always make that decision whether to make it or not, Because sometimes we go through hell recording, sometimes we don't,
Yeah.
And sometimes it's not worth it. And now, the problem now is, in the old days, when we needed an album, Paul and I got together and produced an album, or produced enough songs for it. Nowadays, there's 4 of us, 3 of us writing prolifically, and trying to fit it on one album. And it's not like we're wrestling in the studio trying to get a song on. We all do it the same way, we take it in turns to record a track, But usually George lost out, because Paul and I are tougher. But it's not, it gets to, we don't want to fight about it, Now, half the tracks on Abbey Road, I'm not on something. Half the tracks on a double album, and way back, it depends. We're not always on this, sometimes only 2 Beatles on a track. But it got to the situation, if we have the name Beatle on it, it sells, And when we begin to think like that, then there's something wrong,
Then you begin to get...
Well, then you begin to think, what are we selling?
During the following months, Paul McCartney was writing and producing various other artists. Ringo was attending the premiere of his new film, The Magic Christian, co-starring Peter Sellers. George Harrison was also recording, while John Lennon was spending more time with Yoko Ono. 1970 was the start of a new decade and the end of the Beatles. Saturday, January 4th, recording Let It Be, the Beatles' last recording session as a group. Although there were 2 further recording sessions for the Let It Be album, involving just one member of the Beatles, this was their last time recording as a group, albeit without John Lennon. Having completed I, Me, Mine the previous day, the Beatles turned their attention to Paul McCartney's song Let It Be. The U.S. release of the song was March 11th. On April 10th, 1970, Paul McCartney announces that the Beatles had split. With his debut solo album, McCartney, due for release on the 17th of April, 1970, Paul McCartney chose not to do any promotional interviews. Instead, he asked Apple's Peter Brown to write a list of questions to which he supplied the answers. They included his ruminations on the Beatles and the end of his partnership with John Lennon. McCartney's self-interview caused an immediate storm after its contents were revealed by Daily Mirror journalist Don Short, and its contents were widely reported around the world. Although speculation had been rife for the previous 6 months, confirmation that the group was no more still came as a shock to many.
Well, I'll get the transparencies to you, or to the studio. Tomorrow afternoon. All right, fine. Okay, fine. So they can get together every so often, making an LP for the sake of nostalgia or something, but I think Lennon and McCartney could very well become the Rodgers and Hammerstein writing team for films and for musicals and for songs generally. I mean, if there's any doubt about that. I think they're not stuck in a rush of the Liverpool sound or beats or anything like that. And some of their recent records or recent songs have shown that. I think they're capable of great things in the writing field. Ringo, I think he could, with the right film part, I think he could possibly be quite a good comedy performer.
And George?
He enjoys it anyway, that much I know. George? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. He'd probably open a string of Indian restaurants.
Hey, can I have a word? Are the Beatles going to go their own ways in 1967? They could be, you know, on our own or together. We're always involved with each other, whatever we're doing. You know.
Could you ever see a time when, in fact, you weren't working together?
I could see us working not together for a period, but we'd always get together for one reason or another. Like, I mean, you need other people for ideas as well, but you know, and we all get along fine.
Will you be doing films on your own next year?
No, I don't want to make a career of it. I did it just because I felt like doing it. Dick Lester asked me, and I said yes. And I wouldn't have done it if the others hadn't liked it. Yeah. They said fine, because we were on holiday anyway.
Do the others have film ambitions on their own?
No, nobody's particularly interested in it. I'm not all that mad on it. You know.
What do you really want to do? I mean,
I don't know. I just want to do a few things, you know.
You haven't really decided exactly what?
No, I'll try a few things, you know, but I just found out a bit more about films doing that. You know.
What's the songwriting thing will keep going on whatever happens, will it?
Yeah, we'll probably carry on writing music forever, you know, whatever else we're doing. Because you just can't stop. You find yourself doing it whether you want to or not.
But you think the tours, like the American tours and the English one, you know, the stands in England?
You know, there must be a point where they don't work anymore because they're not to do with what we're doing, record-wise or film-wise.
In May, the album Let It Be was released, followed by a single, The Long and Winding Road. On the 20th of May, the feature film Let It Be had its UK premiere. Although the Beatles didn't attend, two notable figures from their past were present. Cynthia Lennon and Jane Asher were among the guests, 2 years after they split from John Lennon and Paul McCartney. On December 31st, 1970, Paul McCartney files a lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles' partnership. This was the history of the Beatles, from A to Z.